Chapter 1328. The preparations needed. The initial preparations for building a marionette town were rather boring and tedious. At the very least, Klein believed so. In the ancient palace, Klein sat on the high-back chair belonging to the fool, holding a fountain pen. There were ordinary pieces of paper with the name, age, and the fate of every marionette. As he made the worms of spirit emerge from his body, they formed avatars beside him. Some Kleins sat on the ground, while others occupied the 21 seats other than the fool's. Some conjured beds and lay on them. Then, they summoned different books from the junk pile and started reading them seriously. The books included but were not limited to How to Brew Wine, Train Dispatching, Desert Making Compendium, A Clergyman Prepares, Gas Wall Lamps, Gas Meters, and all kinds of family machinery repair, desilicacy, harbor management, foundations of law, ladies' aesthetic, magazines. These were specialist knowledge that different marionettes needed to grasp. Only by doing so would they be able to act their roles well, allowing him to be realistic in every aspect. Even if they were to engage in a deep conversation with outsiders, they wouldn't expose any problems. It wouldn't be difficult for Klein if he just needed to simply memorize the knowledge, but he had to truly grasp and apply it. Furthermore, he couldn't confuse his characters. He couldn't let a burly and strong switchman with a low income be talking about the wonders of a particular skincare product, or which silk cloth was flawed. If such a situation were to happen in novels, plays, and operas, it might create a strange attraction, but putting it in the real world was clearly uncanny and not beneficial to the advancement of the ritual. To avoid such a problem, Klein could only work harder in the early stages. He hoped that every character in a marionette town would be real, whole, and appropriate. Fortunately, there weren't many people in a city who needed to deeply understand the corresponding specialist knowledge. Most of the residents were half illiterate, or really illiterate. They relied on experience to live their lives that they repeated via motions. For these characters, the knowledge that Klein needed to grasp was relatively little, just like workers who had gone through simple training, or even without any training, to be sent to the assembly line. After an unknown period of time, Klein put down his fountain pen and rubbed his temples, letting out a long sigh of relief. He had finally written down the information about nearly 5,000 residents in the marionette town, and his corresponding knowledge preparation was almost complete. This is like a super large-scale movie directed by a director, and with me being the scriptwriter. Same for the lighting engineer, the makeup artist, and all the actors. For this ritual, I'm really on the verge of losing control. If I'm not careful, my personality will dissociate and I'll fall into the abyss of madness. Luckily, I have a professional psychologist. Yes, I have to pay attention to a problem in the town's operations. Although I'm a gentleman with manners, most of the residents in town have low socioeconomic status. Be it speaking or acting, they're more inclined towards being vulgar. I can't make a mistake during the acting and become set back by my psychological barriers. Klein sighed silently as the avatars around him disintegrated into worms of spirit before he got them to burrow into his body. Of course, this wasn't all. There was also one Klein, who maintained his previous state, preparing to be on Sapphira Castle duty. In the next second, Klein returned to the real world and took out creeping hunger from the historical void. Then he teleported to an island that was located in the Berserk Sea but one that clearly deviated from the safe sea route. This was the stage he had chosen before. This place was isolated from the storms all year round. There were no signs of human activity, only a large forest and animals that lived off the forest. Klein looked around and chose an open area. He pressed his right hand to his left chest and prayed sincerely, "I wish that there's a city suitable for 5,000 people here." Just as he said that, Klein raised his right hand and snapped his fingers. Suddenly, this open area became extremely flat. The surrounding forest also receded greatly, providing large amounts of wood, stones, and soil. Almost at the same time, buildings rose up from the ground. They took form with stone and wood. The highest wasn't more than 4 stories high. The style was closer to the Lone Kingdom's Desi Bay. In just the blink of an eye, residential buildings, a library, a police station, a telegraph office, A city hall, a small hospital, a candy factory, a water plant, a gas company, a steam locomotive station, parallel train tracks, and plantations outside the city took form. The streets were also paved with cement or stone bricks. Towards the end, on the square in the middle of the town, a pointed-tip cathedral emerged from the ground and stood proudly. This was a cathedral belonging to the Evernight goddess, as it was in line with the background setting of the city. I hope this island has a deep-sea harbor. Klein didn't stop as he made a second wish. He snapped his fingers again, fulfilling his wish. About 3 kilometers away from the town, a small-scale harbor quickly took shape. There were 2 docks, 5 warehouses, a port hotel, a simple restaurant, a police station branch, a bar, a lighthouse, and a naval base. I wish for the harbor and town to have convenient transportation. Klein made a third wish. He raised his right hand and snapped his fingers. A concrete road and a cargo rail instantly appeared between the town and the harbor. According to Klein's plan, a portion of the harbor was prepared for visitors by sea. The town was mainly for outsiders from the northern and southern continent. As he looked at the empty city with admiration, Klein pressed his top hat and teleported to the municipal square. He walked step by step into the cathedral named St. Ariana Cathedral. The cathedral's door was open, and it was dark inside. After an unknown period of time, 3 figures appeared at the door. They were a 30-year-old gentleman in a formal suit with a tie, an ordinary-looking and gentle-looking woman, and a child who was dressed like an adult. The woman took a few steps with difficulty before stretching her neck. Then she smiled and reached out her hands to hold the gentleman's arm. The gentleman had a faint smile on his face. As he allowed the lady to lean on him, he reached out his right hand and held the boy. The little boy was skipping about, appearing very lively. Their actions were a little rough at first, but the more they walked, the smoother they became as they walked through the square. After they left, more and more people walked out of St. Ariana Cathedral. They consisted of the police, repair workers, gas company employees, restaurant chefs, white-haired old men, and simply dressed farmers. In the next hour, people constantly came out of the Evernight Cathedral. They either turned to different streets and went to different places, entering different houses, stopping at the square, or enjoying the pigeonless scenery. During this process, the number of people that came out had exceeded the limits of the cathedral's capacity, but there seemed to be no end to the people, as though the interior was connected to another city. After another 15 minutes, the entrance of St. Ariana Cathedral finally fell silent. However, there were rats, cockroaches, moths, ants, flies, and mosquitoes creeping outwards. Finally, a colorful window at the top of the cathedral opened. White pigeons flew out and landed in the middle of the square. The people who had stayed there came to life completely. Some teased the pigeons, others looked for hawkers, while some played a 7-string guitar, and others smiled as they conversed with their friends. A man wearing a top hat and a trench coat and carrying a cane left the municipal square. He came to the other side of the town and stopped in front of a wooden board. He took out his tools and wrote the name of the town on the wooden board, Yarnum. After some thought, the man wiped away Yarnum and wrote another name, Utopia. Backlund, inside the Hull family's luxurious villa. Alfred has already boarded the cruise ship back to the northern continent? Audrey didn't hide her surprise. It was September 1352. In the past half a year, Audrey didn't spend too much effort to make her father give up the thought of returning to East Chester County for the first half of the year. This was because there was a pressing need to rebuild Backlund and Constant City. The kingdom's political scene also needed a new balance. Earl Hall had too many things to handle and wasn't in the mood for a vacation. Therefore, whenever Earl Hall was put in a difficult spot, she just needed to take the initiative to say that she was willing to remain in Backlund and return to East Chester County in the next 6 months to have things develop as she wanted and receive praise for. As for the psychology alchemists, they didn't rush her either. Up to now, the Psychology Alchemists Council meeting had been held 3 times. It was mainly to communicate their research results and the various information of the areas under their jurisdiction. Only Ma'am Greed had asked about the clues to the Mind Dragon twice. To be frank, if Mr. Fool hadn't reminded Audrey to take note of the rabbit, wrath, and the easily forgettable president, she would definitely find the conference interesting. Mr. Rabbit had plenty of ideas, but she remained as vigilant as ever. Yes, the liner has already left the harbor. Earl Hall smiled and nodded. When Alfred arrives in Backlund and completes the necessary social intercourse, we will return to East Chester County for fox hunting. Autumn was the best time to hunt foxes. Audrey tersely acknowledged. All right. As a major general in the army, Alfred didn't follow the naval fleet to Desi Bay. Instead, he led his adjutants and squires and boarded a steam-powered sailboat hybrid for Pritz Harbor. After traveling for nearly 2 days, they encountered a storm in the Berserk Sea. As the ship shook violently, the sailors on the observatory saw some light through their telescopes. It came from a lighthouse. Author's note: I wrote in detail 3 plans in the previous chapter because I felt that the third plan was most impactful, but it's impossible for Klein to undertake it with his character, so I had to unfortunately give it up. I specially wrote it out for all of you to have a sense of what's the most bizarre and mysterious method. Chapter 1329. A night without any abnormalities. The liner passed through the storm and approached the lighthouse. A small-scale harbor entered the sights of the captain, sailors, and passengers through the gloomy rain. A short while later, a man in his 30s, who was wearing a blue uniform and holding onto a black umbrella and a glass lantern, appeared at the dock. He used rather uncommon actions to guide the liner to moor. As the man watched the gangway lower, he opened his mouth and shouted, "Hey matey, where d'ya come from?" After most of his voice was swallowed by the wind, his voice successfully reached the liner's interior and entered Alfred's ears. "Do you know what this place is?" Alfred looked carefully at his adjutant and squire. He wasn't wearing a general's ceremonial attire. Wearing a black trench coat that was commonly seen in Backlund, his dazzling blonde hair drooped down casually, and his blue eyes looked like a deep lake in a forest. The adjutant, who had neatly combed his hair to the back, first shook his head to indicate his uncertainty before he explained, "The storm from before made me lose my bearings." At this moment, the captain held an umbrella and came to the shipboard. He answered the man, "We left East Balham 2 days ago and unfortunately encountered a storm. What harbor is this?" The man's eyes darted around for a moment. Without giving a direct answer, he shouted, "Wait a moment, will ya?" He then turned around, holding the umbrella and the lantern as he ran towards the buildings near the dock. This reaction was beyond the expectations of Alfred and the other passengers, but it wasn't strange for the experienced ship captain, first mate, and others. They had encountered many abnormalities at the ports along the Berserk Sea. This made them patiently wait for subsequent developments. 5 to 6 minutes later, the man led a lady over. The woman didn't have an umbrella and was wearing a hooded raincoat smeared with Donningsman tree sap. As the two of them approached the liner, under the watch of the armed sailors, they climbed up the gangway to the deck. At such a distance, most of the passengers finally saw what the two of them looked like. The man had brown hair and brown eyes. His skin was rough, and it was obvious that he was of a lower socioeconomic status and had suffered the elements. The woman was in her 20s, and her eyes were limpid green. She had long, flaxen hair. A few wet strands clung to her face, making her appear pure and charming. This was a rather pretty lady with a wild temperament. "Hi there, this is Utopia Harbor," the man impatiently introduced. "I'm Theodore, the interim port captain." As he spoke, he laughed, as though he was happy that he had invented such an amazing position. Of course, the ship captain knew what a so-called interim port captain meant. He didn't take it to heart about this sudden happiness of a small fry. He frowned slightly and said, "Utopia Harbor? Why haven't I heard of it?" Theodore looked at him and said, "What ye said is quite common. Heh, if it weren't for that landlubber hurricane, ye might never come here." Without waiting for him to say anything else, the lady rushed forward and said, "Utopia isn't on the safe sea route. Usually, only people who understand these waters and know of this place will come here for supplies." So the main clientele of this harbor are pirates? How could the ship captain not be able to tell what she meant? And in times like this, tacitly acknowledging things without exposing them provided protection to both sides. He tersely acknowledged and said, "And you are?" My name is Tracy. The lady smiled. I'm the owner of the Harbor Hotel and also its receptionist and attendant. She surveyed the area and said, It's quite a heavy storm, and the ship will be bumpy. It's not a wise choice to stay in there to rest. The hotel will provide you with stable beds, warm water, clean food, warm blankets, and an environment that will remind you of home. It's only 10 pence a night. I'm referring to the price of a single room. Other than that, you guys can still drink at the nearby bar and enjoy our warm hospitality. Clearly, this lady was here to solicit for business. The captain was rather alert and didn't respond directly. He nodded and said, I can't decide on behalf of the passengers. They are free to choose for themselves. Of course, as captain, I will stay here with my crew. Tracy maintained her smile and said, I'll wait at the hotel for guests who are willing to disembark. She seemed to have received a certain amount of education. She wasn't as hot and spirited as the women at other ports who spewed vulgarities with every sentence. Tracy turned around and was about to return when Theodore approached her and said with a sullen expression, You have to thank me for telling you the news immediately. As he spoke, his right hand pressed against Tracy's but before he pinched hard. But Tracy swatted away his hand and chided, You're a jerk who should be fucked by a donkey. She took a few steps forward and left the liner by the gangway. Theodore shook his hands and cursed with a smile, Bitch? This scene suddenly moved many passengers on board. To them, the biggest flaw on the ship was that it was boring, and there was a bar at the harbor. This meant that they could meet cheap street girls who were unlike those from the northern or southern continent. There were local street girls with their unique local charm. If one was lucky or willing to spend a lot of money, one of them might even be able to sleep with that spirited beauty with an attitude. Instantly, many passengers packed their luggage and prepared to head to the Harbor Hotel. Upon seeing this, Alfred's adjutant asked, General, are we getting off the ship? Alfred shook his head slowly. We don't know anything about this place. We have to be careful. Staying on the ship is the best choice. The adjutant had no objections to this. He asked worriedly, What about those who have already alighted? That's their choice. Alfred looked out of the window expressionlessly. If an accident happens, we can only keep more people safe. If it's not serious, then we will be able to resolve it easily. With that said, he turned to look at his adjutant and squire. We'll take turns to keep watch tonight to prevent any accidents. Alfred, who had interacted with the Numinous Episcopate, the Rose School of Thought, and other organizations in the southern continent, had an instinctive sense of vigilance towards unfamiliar places. After he exchanged his opinion with the ship captain, Alfred got into bed, listening to the strong winds hitting the glass windows and the torrential rain pattering the deck. He was about to doze off. At this moment, he heard a tender and sad melody coming from the direction of the harbor. It seemed to come from a flute, intermittent like a human whimpering through the storm. Alfred was instantly immersed in the music. It was as though he had returned to Backlund, which always appeared in his dreams. He returned to a state that was a mixture of his happy childhood days, the vexing times of his youth, and other emotions. He shook his head violently and shook off the feeling. He realized that it wasn't a psychological effect, but a normal person's reaction. Alfred rolled out of bed and walked to the window. Using his Sheriff Beyonder powers, he confirmed that the music he had heard had come from the cheap hotel. It's not from the guests on board the ship. Their goal is very clear. They wouldn't be in the mood to play such a melody. There are tourists in Utopia to begin with, or could it be that owner and part-time attendant named Tracy? If it were her, she would be a lady with a story. Alfred sighed and retracted his gaze. He stopped pondering over the matter. Although he was curious, he had no intention of getting off the ship. Soon the sound of the flute stopped. The Harbor Hotel regained its silence and nothing unexpected happened. Just like that, time passed, and as the storm stopped, the sky gradually brightened. At 8 in the morning, the liner passengers returned one after another. Every one of them had weak steps and looked haggard. Upon seeing this, the sailors immediately laughed and said, The chicks here seem pretty good. The passengers shook their heads at the same time and looked regretful. One of them rubbed his temples and said, The Lanty proof here isn't bad. It's cheaper than other places. I wasn't careful and had a little too much to drink and ended up falling asleep. I don't even know if anything happened with that babe. Sigh. I woke up to realize that the ship was about to leave, and I don't even remember what I did after getting drunk. Praise the lady. She let me lie in bed and not sleep in the rain. The other passengers chimed in to express their similar experiences. Of course, everyone had different details. For example, some passengers praised the breakfast dessert in the cheap hotel. The sailors were regretful that they didn't manage to drink the cheap and good Lanty proof. They started teasing the passengers. Perhaps the one who spent the night with you wasn't the chicks here but the burly man like Theodore. Since all of you were drunk, there's no way to know what happened. Huh, try touching your assholes. Amidst the lively atmosphere, the sailors withdrew the gangway and raised the sails, allowing the liner to set off slowly. Alfred finally relaxed after they passed through a dark sea and returned to the familiar safe sea route. He smiled at his adjutant and squire and said, "You can mark this place on our map," mentioning that the liquor and desserts here aren't too bad. Yes, the girls have their own traits. After a few more days of traveling, the passenger finally arrived at Desi Bay's Eskelson Harbor, after traveling along a winding safe sea route. Alfred, who had the demeanor of a noble and his socialite instincts, paid a visit to the brass of a nearby military base and shared a good dinner with them. When he returned to one of his father's vacation villas, he was surprised to find the squire whom he had sent away to gather for information. "What's wrong?" Alfred put away his disorganized thoughts. The squire lowered his voice and said, "General, all the official maps in the kingdom have no indication of Utopia Harbor." Chapter 1330. Moving in. Alfred felt the room temperature plummet when he heard his squire. An indescribable chill invaded his body, freezing his blood and bone marrow. When the liner stopped at Utopia Port, he had expected the worst situation to happen. Utopia was the headquarters of some cult, and that everyone there was a dangerous lunatic. But now, the truth was even worse. Perhaps Utopia never existed. At that moment, Alfred was unusually thankful that he was no longer the noble scion he was when he left Backlund. He had accumulated a great deal of experience and had thus not really entered Utopia Harbor. Under the gaze of the adjutant and squire, the major general paced back and forth with a solemn expression. He calmly instructed, "Draft up a telegram and report to MI9 about what happened in Utopia. At the same time, request the local official beyonders to immediately take action and contact the captain to list down all the people who entered Utopia Harbor. If necessary, pay each of them a visit and confirm if there are any problems." "Yes, sir." His adjutant immediately stood at attention and saluted. After the adjutant walked out of the study, Alfred said to a squire, "Bring up the typewriter from downstairs. I want to write a detailed report." His plan was to first use a telegram to report the key information to the brass and not delay the initial actions necessary. Then, he would reveal more details with a confidential document and provide more information for the military brass to make a decision. Wendell walked into a second-class carriage with one hand on his top hat and the other carrying a suitcase. He wasn't even 30 years old. His sideburns were deep black and his brown eyes were calm. He didn't have any unique features that anyone could remember, but he exuded comfortable vibes. A few months ago, he was still a Fainapotter intelligence officer who was active in Desi Bay and had contributed greatly. Now that he was a Sequence 7 Beyonder, he was part of MI9's Internal Affairs Department. Today, his goal was to send a confidential document to Backlund and personally hand it into the hands of MI9's director. After sitting down, Wendell bought a newspaper from the paperboy and leisurely read through it. This was just a superficial act. In reality, he began to use his Beyonder powers to illustrate portraits of the passengers around him, remembering all their characteristics, making meticulous and perfect preparations for any accidents that might happen later. The steam locomotive was chugging forward as the scenery outside sped past the windows. A few hours later, Wendell cast his gaze out of the window with some anxiety. The sky was already filled with dark clouds, and a storm was about to descend. This meant that the steam locomotive would stop at a station ahead of time to tide through the storm. It might only continue its journey the next morning and not reach its designated location. In Wendell's opinion, this would undoubtedly lead to more risks due to a deviation in his expectations. However, it was beyond him. He couldn't change the weather like the sea god, who was promoted by the Rørsted Archipelago's new government. The only thing he could do was pray to the Lord of Storms. Reality proved that praying was useless most of the time. By the time the sky turned dark, the station in front of them had already sent a light signal to get the train to slow down and stop. The steam engine whistled again, and the train slowed down. Finally, it stopped at an unfamiliar platform. In the next second, near the steam-powered train's head, the mechanical door opened. The train conductor stood at the entrance and shouted to the staff on the platform, "What happened up ahead?" "Heavy rain. Visibility is 0. The white sideburned employee answered loudly. Just as he finished speaking, a muffled thunder sounded, causing everyone to tremble as they sensed the incoming storm. "Damn it," the train conductor cursed. "Which station is this?" As it wasn't a normal stop, he didn't really know which station he was at. After all, the schedule he was in charge of didn't stop at every station in the past. Utopia. It's a small station. You can arrange the rest yourself. The staff shouted and ran towards the other end of the platform with the glass lantern in hand. "I have to give the train behind a signal." The train conductor had no doubts about the staff's attitude because this was a normal dispatch process. Otherwise, an accident between two steam locomotives would happen. He could even be certain that the other staff members of the Utopia station had already sent a telegram to the other stations to warn them. Of course, they must have received a telegram to learn of the area ahead being enveloped by a heavy storm. Utopia. Wendell repeated the name in a low voice, not finding any useful information in his mind. Of course, he didn't think too much of it. This was because there were many unknown steam locomotive stations in the entire Lone Kingdom. This was a manifestation of the country's overall strength. The train conductor looked at the dark sky and muttered a few words before using the newest megaphone to speak to the passengers on board. "A storm is coming. The train will stop at Utopia Station until 8 in the morning tomorrow." He estimated the storm to continue the entire night. "You can stay in the carriage, or you can exit on your own accord to head into the city to look for an inn. Tomorrow, simply show your ticket stub to board the carriage again. Remember to be on time." The train conductor gave the passengers two choices. Wendell looked at the passengers inside the second-class carriage and pondered for a few seconds before carrying his suitcase and walking out of the train. It wasn't that he couldn't handle the harsh environment that wasn't conducive for good sleep. When he was an intelligence officer, he had been through plenty of hardship. He was only relying on his professionalism that the sealed carriages, which were limited in space for passenger movement, weren't as safe as a single room in an inn. Of course, he could also stay up all night, but this would definitely affect his condition tomorrow. Clearly, he still had a long journey tomorrow. After exiting Utopia Station, Wendell got on a rental carriage by the side of the road and said to the carriage driver, "To the municipal square." In the Lone Kingdom, there would definitely be a cathedral and a hotel near the municipal square. "Sir, are you planning on going to the hotel?" the carriage driver asked as he made the horse turn around, seemingly capable of getting along well with anyone. "Yes." As a Sequence 7 Beyonder, Wendell didn't hide it. In his opinion, as long as he lived in the city center while overseas, he could easily find a group of helpers with his status, and his strength was enough to support him in completing this task. "The best hotel in Utopia is Red Boots. Are we going there?" the coach driver asked in a suggestive tone that all men knew. If he didn't have a mission, Wendell wouldn't mind pleasuring himself. However, he could only shake his head without any hesitation. "I want a quiet hotel." "All right," the coachman replied disappointedly. "Let's go to the Irises Hotel. No one will disturb you there." As the carriage advanced, Wendell cast his gaze outside the window to observe the situation outside. Perhaps it was because the storm was about to arrive, the people on the road were all in a rush. Even the paperboys looked down. A very small city. Wendell came to a preliminary conclusion from the lack of a track carriage. He only saw one trackless carriage. This meant that most of the areas in Utopia could be reached on foot in an adequate amount of time. Just as he had expected, in less than 10 minutes, The rental carriage stopped at the entrance of the Irises Hotel. Wendell paid the fare and rushed into the hotel before the rain fell. He heard pattering sounds behind him just as he entered. After checking in and putting down his luggage, Wendell rested for a while. He kept the confidential document close to him and went to the restaurant on the first floor to enjoy dinner. He cautiously didn't have any alcoholic beverages and asked for a cup of fizzling iced tea, which was supposedly a local specialty, and a fried pork chop drenched in apple juice. As a former intelligence officer of high society, Wendell didn't have much expectations for dinner this time, but he was surprised by the meal. The pork chop was fried in a succulent and juicy manner that gave off a strong fragrance. The apple juice that was poured on it had a slightly acerbic texture that washed away most of the cloyed taste. The fizzling iced tea was refreshing and especially delicious. When he foot the bowl, Wendell nodded at the medium-billed waiter and said, "Please send my compliments to the chef for giving me the pleasure of this wonderful dinner." The ordinary-looking waiter smiled and replied, "That wouldn't be an issue. In all of Utopia City, our chefs are the best." Wendell didn't chit-chat and quickly returned to his room to make some arrangements to prevent others from sneaking in. Then he fell asleep without any hesitation. He used a relatively safe period of time, which any possible enemies would find unsuitable for taking action, to sleep and pass the time late into the night. After an unknown period of time, Wendell was suddenly woken up by an intense argument. He snapped open his pocket watch to take a look and realized that it wasn't even midnight. "It's from next door." A woman's voice. A man's voice. Wendell sat up and listened carefully. Initially, he suspected that it was a man and woman flirting, but later, he realized that it was too intense. Some of the items were even thrown onto the wall. A quarrel turning into a fight? Just as Wendell mumbled, he heard the shouting, cursing, and screaming of a woman. Beating a woman? As a lone gentleman, although Wendell believed in the Lord of Storms and discriminated against women, it didn't stop him from thinking that men shouldn't be violent towards women. After 2 seconds of consideration, he decided to knock on the door and remind his neighbors to take note. At that moment, a tragic cry rang out. This was obviously from a man. Something heavy fell to the floor. Wendell's brows twitched as he sharply caught the scent of a criminal case. He stood up, put on his coat, and went to the room next door. He bent his fingers and knocked twice. A few seconds later, the door creaked open, and a beautiful woman with long, wavy hair appeared in front of Wendell. Her hair was in a mess, and her face was ghastly pale. Her light green clothes were stained with blood, and she was holding a dagger that was dripping with blood. The lady in her early 20s stammered for a while before speaking in a dreamy tone, "I killed someone." Chapter 1331. Pleasure in helping others. Wendell wasn't unfamiliar with murder at all. When he heard that, he wasn't afraid at all. Instead, he calmly allowed his gaze to wander past the woman at the door and into the room's interior. He immediately saw a man lying on the ground. His chest was blood red. "Are you sure he's dead?" Wendell asked calmly. The young lady in her 20s was at a loss at first. Then she answered with uncertainty, "Maybe. I don't know. If there's still hope, we need to send him to the hospital immediately." Wendell's tone was like he was speaking to a patient's family, not a murderer. The lady holding the blood dagger subconsciously turned her body and made way. Wendell took a few steps forward and approached the victim. He didn't need to squat down. He swept his gaze and made a judgment based on various signs. He is indeed dead. The woman in her 20s with messy, flaxen-colored hair didn't show any obvious change in expression. She looked down at her toes and said, "Call the police." "How do I address you?" Wendell had already heard hurried footsteps coming from the stairs. It was obvious that the attendant or hotel owner came up to check on the commotion after hearing the screams. "Tracy," the pure lady with an attitude answered softly. She then sank into her own world and didn't say another word. Wendell was just about to say something when the owner of the hotel who had helped him check in previously had already rushed through the door. "Goddess," the elderly man shouted after seeing the situation in the room. Wendell pressed down with his right hand, gesturing for him to calm down before saying, "Call the police immediately. I'll stay here and watch." His temperament and words exuded a sense of confidence that convinced others. The owner of the hotel didn't waste any time and immediately turned around and ran downstairs. As for Wendell, when he first came over to check on the situation, it was just a habit as a gentleman. In fact, he didn't have the intention to get involved in it. After all, he was still shouldering the mission. However, Miss Tracy's dazed, detached, and cold attitude induced a sense of pity in him. This was a normal reaction for a man. He surveyed the area as though he was conversing with the air. Killing someone doesn't imply a harsh punishment. It can be categorized into many kinds of situations. Tracy slowly raised her head and cast her gaze at the gentleman. There was an indescribable luster in her lifeless eyes. Wendell glanced at her bruised face. "He hit you?" "Yes." The man seemed to have some sort of authority, making Tracy, who wanted to remain silent, finally answer. Wendell looked down at the dagger that was no longer dripping blood. "Was it you who brought it here, or him?" Tracy's response was a little slow as she replied, "Him." Wendell nodded slightly and said, "Exercising your right to self-defense is in line with the law. I can testify to the police that you had an intense argument before it happened and that there was a fight. Clearly, men naturally possess an advantage in this aspect. I'm not discriminating against women, but it's something explained by science and experience." He paused and asked, "What is the relationship between the two of you? What happened?" Tracy's eyes darted about and she recovered a little from that deep, reclusive state. She seemed to be answering a policeman's question as she said with a look of hope and sorrow, I am his mistress." Upon saying this, a self-deprecating smile appeared on Tracy's face. "I used to be an ugly woman who blindly chased after money. Not long after I left the grammar school, I became his mistress under his enticement. He gave me a hotel and let me stay there. I wait for his arrival or for him to summon me every week. I lost interest in this lifestyle, feeling increasingly suppressed as my inferiority complex grew. I wanted to return everything to him and get rid of him completely, but he wasn't agreeable. He threatened me using all sorts of methods and refused to let me leave him. The recent times we met all ended in fights. Just now, he said that there was only one way to leave him, and that was death. Then he beat me up and took out a dagger. Why, you know what happened after that, mistress?" Wendell cast a regretful and pitiful glance at Tracy's face and said, "The traces at the scene have also confirmed the development of the situation." He had originally thought that Tracy and the deceased were husband and wife, but to his surprise, their relationship was worse than he had imagined. Tracy nodded blankly and said, "Thank you." She didn't say another word. She only broke the silence when the police arrived. She raised her hands and accepted the handcuffs. Wendell looked at her staggered pace and said to the police, "Bring her to check on her injuries first and treat them to avoid any accidents." The police officers didn't know why they had to listen to instructions from a witness. In short, they led Tracy and Wendell to a small hospital in the city without any objections under the heavy rain. As Tracy was a woman, Wendell and 2 police officers waited in the corridor of the hospital without entering the room. As time passed, Wendell saw a pregnant woman being sent to the delivery room in a hurry. There seemed to be some problems and they needed help with the labor process. After a while, he heard the sound of a baby crying, an announcement of a new life coming to this world. At this moment, Tracy happened to come out. "Do you feel it?" "Life's beauty," Wendell said to Tracy solemnly. As Tracy listened to the baby's cries amidst the howling wind and rain, her expression was clearly touched. Her face had already been wiped clean, making her look very clean and simple. After a few seconds, Tracy returned to her senses and nodded at Wendell before saying, "Thank you." This time, she was no longer as numb, blank, and reclusive. Wendell secretly heaved a sigh of relief and followed her to the police station to record a statement. After doing what was necessary, Wendell walked to the street side and prepared to take a rental carriage back to the Irises Hotel. However, in the middle of the stormy night, there were no pedestrians or carriages on the road. This is the disadvantage of a small city. "It's not convenient enough," Wendell muttered. He opened the umbrella he had brought with him and made his way back to the Irises Hotel. As a former sheriff, he had the memory, in the mystical sense, of the route he had taken before. He wasn't worried about getting lost in the small city. At this moment, the storm had already reduced significantly. However, the strong winds continued to sweep past Wendell, causing rain to fall on him. This caused Wendell to raise his right hand and block his chest. That confidential document was hidden on the inside of the clothing. Wendell had previously kept the document close to him even when he was sleeping, not allowing it to be separated from him. For this reason, he had already developed a habit. As long as he had the corresponding self-reminders, he wouldn't turn over once he fell asleep. After walking for about 15 minutes in the small town of Utopia, Wendell saw the Iris's hotel. At that moment, his top hat and clothes were drenched due to the strong winds. This made him a little worried that the confidential document would be damaged by the water. Strictly speaking, I have already violated the rules of the mission, but how could I not help a lady like her? This is what a gentleman should do. Wendell was slightly vexed, but he didn't regret it at all. After entering the room, he immediately removed his jacket and took out the document, placing it on the table. The envelope containing the document was already visibly soaked. There were quite a few places that seemed to tear with a little force. Wendell immediately rang the bell and called for an attendant to ask for a gas stove, hoping to raise the temperature in the room and accelerate the air-drying process of the sealed document. In the process of waiting, he realized that the silence expected from the middle of the night wasn't there. It was as if the screams and the police's arrival had caused the tenants and nearby residents to wake up without being able to fall asleep. The howling winds lessened significantly, and Wendell could hear children crying, married couples arguing, the sound of a wooden violin being played, intermittent sobbing, the footsteps on the stairs, and the occasional sounds of discussion that were sometimes suppressed and sometimes raised without realizing it. He didn't feel anything about this lively scene. He just felt that they were noisy that prevented him from calming down. After a while, the attendant brought over a coal stove. Wendell relaxed and asked casually, "Do you know that Miss Tracy?" The thin attendant shook his head. "No." He then added, "I heard that she's a local, but I've been living outside in the plantations outside the city before this year." "What do you know about her?" Wendell asked subconsciously. "She comes to our hotel 3 to 5 times a month, with the dead man." The waiter suddenly sighed. "She's not happy at all." Wendell was silent for a few seconds before dismissing the attendant and returning to his desk. Seconds ticked by as the envelope outside the confidential document gradually dried up. At this moment, the inside and outside of the hotel had become relatively quiet. Only the sound of rain falling and the sound of the windows being rattled by the winds could be heard. Wendell was full of spirit as he recalled everything that had happened. He sighed for Miss Tracy's life and flipped the envelope. At this moment, he realized that some damage had appeared on the bottom part of the envelope, revealing the piece of paper inside. Wendell frowned, knowing that he was about to be punished. Of course, the punishment wouldn't be too heavy, as if the document to be distributed was confidential enough, he wouldn't be the only one to dispatch it. Wendell had originally planned on maintaining the present state and showing the damaged situation during the handover. However, when he swept his gaze, he saw a word on the document through the hole: Utopia. Wendell's nerves tightened, and he felt as if the sound of the wind and rain outside had suddenly stopped. Chapter 1332. Shocked in the middle of the night. Why is the confidential document that I'm dispatching mentioning Utopia? What's so special about this place? Many thoughts flashed through Wendell's mind as he heard a buzzing sound. At this moment, he felt as though he was going to fall sick from overexertion. Wendell quickly forced himself to calm down. He carefully recalled all the experiences he had encountered after coming to Utopia, and he discovered that there were no problems with every detail. They were all things that he might encounter in daily life. The only thing that made him uneasy was that his arrival was too coincidental. It was common for the steam locomotive to stop at the last minute due to a storm, but to stop somewhere related to the confidential document in his hand couldn't be explained away with coincidence. Wendell stared at the confidential document on the table with a solemn expression. He hesitated as to whether he should open them and read them carefully. Perhaps it's just a passing mention of Utopia. My actions will severely violate internal affairs. Perhaps this is the report of a certain intelligence agent secretly investigating Utopia. The contents will decide whether I survive to a certain extent or die. After struggling for a while, Wendell looked out the window at the dark night sky and reached for the document. Only by being alive could one consider the punishment. Having made up his mind, Wendell swiftly removed the envelope outside and flipped through the typed files inside. As he read, his hand trembled slightly. He felt a chill run down his back. Even the burning furnace didn't help. No matter which angle he read it from, the confidential report in his hands indicated that there was something wrong with Utopia, the entire town. This might be a city that didn't exist in the real world. Wendell felt his mouth go dry, as though he had heard the footsteps of death slowly approaching him with a sickle. Instinctively, he wanted to get up, but in the end, he controlled himself and didn't react rashly. This was because he could feel pairs of eyes staring at him in the darkness outside, the room upstairs, and the corridor outside. What should I do? Up till now, nothing abnormal happened. This means that if I didn't know anything, it's possible that I'd be safe and welcome daybreak. I've read through a lot of information, and if I rashly show that I already know about the strange environment around me, it would only cause danger to erupt ahead of time. However, I can't just not do anything and leave my fate to luck. Wendell recalled all the dangers he had experienced before and quickly made up his mind. He was prepared to immediately return to the steam locomotive and stay far away from Utopia to a certain extent. At least, most of the people there were normal, while the city was full of danger. Of course, Wendell couldn't just run back like that. He had to act normal, as though he had left the hotel in the middle of the night to return to the steam locomotive station. Amidst his thoughts, Wendell put away his confidential report and stood up calmly. He put on his coat and put on his top hat. Then, with his luggage in one hand and an umbrella in the other, he calmly walked to the door and turned the doorknob. At this moment, the corridor was dark, with only a few gas lamps on both sides of the corridor giving off light that wasn't bright enough. It added signs of human life to the silent environment in which he could hear a pin drop. When Wendell entered the corridor, the wooden floor beneath his feet made a slight creaking sound. It was so clear in the silent night that it traveled far into the distance. With a slight frown, Wendell intentionally took a normal step forward and approached the staircase in the middle of the corridor. He walked without any worries and had no intention of acting furtively. As he saw the stairs getting closer, he suddenly heard a squeaking sound behind him. "Sir, where are you going?" A slightly hoarse and intermittent male voice sounded in Wendell's ears. Wendell's body stiffened. He slowly turned back and saw the wooden door to the service room open. An attendant came out and stood in the shadows of the door. He quickly smiled and said calmly, "I have an important item on the steam locomotive. I'm afraid that someone would take it away, so I have no choice but to return now." At this point, he softly grumbled, "A murder happened at the hotel. I don't want to stay here anymore. I can't sleep at all. I'm very sorry." The attendant bowed slightly and responded, "I won't spread the news." Wendell nodded with a promise and then walked back up the stairs. Perhaps it was due to the dim lighting in the night, he walked very carefully. Every step was like walking on the edge of a precipice. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. Wendell, who had been on guard towards the attendant behind him, finally returned to the first floor. At that moment, not a single person was present in the hotel lobby. All the items were hidden in the darkness, and the faint light from the outside cast a blurry silhouette, just like monsters eager to devour people. Wendell looked ahead and walked through the dark lobby before reaching the door. Just as he pushed open the door and went out, he suddenly heard some rustling sounds behind him. It was as if there were rats moving around, or it was as if someone was approaching him with light footsteps. The back of Wendell's head went numb, but he held back his impulse to make a dash for it. He raised his head normally and looked up at the sky, which had already stopped raining. Then he inhaled the cold, fresh air and made his way to the steam locomotive station. He quickened his pace, looking like he was afraid of the night and eager to end this journey. As he walked, Wendell saw a signboard from the corner of his eye. Utopia Telegraph Office. The telegraph office. Perhaps I can try sneaking in and send an emergency telegram to the Backlund headquarters and Eskelsen military base. That way, I can look forward to the rescue from demigods. If I'm really trapped here and unable to leave, this will be the only way to save myself. Wendell thought for a moment before taking a few steps diagonally, arriving at the entrance of the Utopia telegraph office. He wasn't in a hurry to find a place to sneak in. Instead, he focused his attention and listened to the movements inside. Following that, he heard intermittent sounds of heavy breathing. This made Wendell occasionally feel that there was no one inside, and at times, he felt that there was more than one person inside. Suddenly, the sound of breathing stopped. All of Wendell's hair stood on end. His intuition told him that a figure was standing quietly behind the door of the telegraph office. Without any hesitation, Wendell immediately gave up the thought of sending a telegram. He walked past the door and continued proceeding forward. For the rest of the journey, even a gust of wind left Wendell trembling in fear. He was afraid of encountering an unknown danger. Time passed slowly as Wendell experienced the torment. Finally, he reached the entrance of the steam locomotive station and saw that the door was tightly shut. He couldn't enter. This wasn't a problem for Wendell. He first passed the umbrella to his left hand that was carrying his luggage, then went to the side and found a wall. With a press of his palm, he rose into the air and easily flipped over. After landing his feet firmly on the ground, Wendell heaved a sigh of relief and began walking towards the platform at an unhurried pace. At that moment, an inaudible sound of footsteps could be heard behind him. "What are you doing here?" A deep and hoarse voice rang out. Wendell's toes tightened as cold sweat broke out on his back. He didn't hesitate. As he prepared to get violent, he made his body turn slowly and stiffly. The first thing that entered his eyes was a classic glass lantern, followed by the staff member from before. Wendell exhaled and grumbled, "It's not appropriate for you to appear in such an environment on such a night. As a gentleman, you have to avoid scaring others." "I'm not a gentleman," the staff member replied in an unfriendly manner. Wendell pointed to the corner of the platform. "I'm going to the bathroom." He had already observed the platform's environment and layout of the platform earlier in the day. "Then why are you here?" the worker asked. "I'm lost," Wendell answered simply. Following that, he ignored the staff and walked towards the bathroom. Behind him, the staff member watched silently without saying a word. This gave Wendell a lot of mental stress, but he maintained his gait very well. In the bathroom, under the illumination of the wall lamps, Wendell took nearly a minute to relieve the tension in his body and successfully peed. After returning to the steam locomotive, Wendell finally found a sense of security as he looked at the passengers lying on their beds. In the next few hours, he didn't sleep at all and was on guard against any accidents. Just as Wendell's grasp of the passage of time slowed down, the sky gradually brightened and dispersed the darkness. In the next 2 hours, the travelers who had gone to Utopia returned one after another. Some bought a bottle of local red wine. Some looked haggard. They looked like they had been beaten up or were hungover. Wendell was very wary of them, but he couldn't discover anything unusual in the details. Finally, the whistle sounded as the steam locomotive slowly began to move. Amidst the chugging sounds, the train left Utopia Station. After that, they went through another dark, gloomy weather. Fortunately, no thunderstorm descended, and the sun quickly pierced through the clouds and illuminated the ground. For Wendell, all of this was normal. It had been like this since he arrived at Utopia last night. If not for the confidential report which was hidden near his chest, he definitely wouldn't have believed that there was any problem with Utopia. When the steam locomotive reached the next stop, one that everyone was familiar with, Wendell finally relaxed. He felt as if his brain ached with a throb, as though he had been drained of his energy. At this moment, he quickly recalled his experience in Utopia. As he recalled, Wendell suddenly sat up straight. He had used the excuse of going to the bathroom last night, but he was carrying his luggage and an umbrella. He didn't look like a passenger who had just come down from a steam train. The station worker didn't realize this, or rather, he had already discovered it, but he did not expose him for some unknown reason. Chapter 1333 Warning. Using his experience as example, all of a sudden, The muscles on Wendell's back began to tense up as if he were about to explode. He was shocked and doubtful as several guesses flashed through his mind. The residents of Utopia are monsters in human skin. They usually look normal, but once they encounter blind spots in logic, they would show a side that is different from an ordinary person, ignoring the points that are obviously problematic? Or perhaps that staff realized that I was lying and was unwilling to deal with me, so he pretended not to see me and let me go? For what? Yes, carrying my luggage to the bathroom can be explained away as me being afraid of losing my luggage, but the entire platform is sheltered. There's no need to take the umbrella. Besides, the rain had already stopped. Wendell instinctively turned his gaze out of the window, only to see the sunlight shining on the platform he was at. One by one, passengers waited in order behind the safety line, completely different from the dark and gloomy vibes that Utopia gave off. Phew. He exhaled and suddenly relaxed. This isn't Utopia. I've already left. Wendell murmured to himself as he wiped away the cold sweat that had seeped out from his forehead. When he recalled his oversight earlier, it was as if he had fallen into a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from no matter how hard he tried. After a while, Wendell stood up and decided to smoke at the platform to ease his mood. The tobacco comforted him greatly, allowing him to recall his past experiences in Utopia. During this process, he gained inspiration from his encounter. Maybe it's because I sincerely helped Tracy, so that staff member intentionally ignored my problematic actions and let me go? Compared to the entire population of Utopia being monsters hiding underneath human skin, Wendell was more willing to accept this explanation. At this moment, from the corner of his eye, he saw the conductor talking to a group of people in a corner. Wendell took a few steps forward, trying to hear what they were saying. With the help of his hearing that transcended the normal limits of hearing, he vaguely heard the conversation from a distance that wouldn't incur suspicion. Last night the station, Utopia, doesn't exist in the kingdom. Please keep it a secret. Wendell's brows twitched slightly. Based on the description of the document near his chest, he roughly understood what the train conductor was talking about. They were saying that the kingdom didn't have a station known as Utopia at all, and last night, the steam locomotive had gone missing. At that moment, a strong sense of horror surged through Wendell's heart again. He felt that it was his greatest blessing to be able to leave Utopia alive. Alfred spent nearly a week before returning to Backlund from Eskelsen Harbor. This was because he had visited the family of his deceased comrades, his old friends, the elders who had returned to their fief for vacation, and some of his family's business partners along the way. This is even more tiring than participating in battle, Alfred grumbled to his father, Earl Hall. Earl Hall smiled and pointed at the staircase. Return to your room and get some rest. We'll talk in the study later. He was quite satisfied with the mental state and progress of his second son. Alfred surveyed the area and asked with a smile, "Where's the most dazzling jewel of Backlund?" He paused for a moment before adding, "What about Hibbert?" Earl Hall laughed and said, "Audrey went to her foundation and will only return in the afternoon. She kept complaining that you couldn't provide her with a definite schedule, preventing her from knowing when you would arrive. Hibbert is now a cabinet secretary. He's very busy." Alfred nodded and returned to his room to take a shower. He changed into a shirt, vest, and formal suit. "I prefer East Balham's casualness." He looked into the mirror and smiled at his adjutant. "This outfit makes you look more like a noble," his adjutant said as he handed him the document in his hand. "General, this is from MI9. Me 9. Alfred thoughtfully destroyed the seal on the envelope. "There's a result regarding the investigation of Utopia that quickly?" Before he could finish his sentence, he pulled out the document and flipped through it. During this process, Alfredo flipped through the pages slower and slower. In the end, he read it again from the first page. The main content of this investigation was divided into two parts. The first was regarding the MI9 member who had dispatched Alfred's report. He had accidentally entered Utopia and witnessed a murder case. He managed to forcefully escape in the middle of the night and return to the steam locomotive. The second was that the railways in Desi Bay which led to Backlund didn't have a stop named Utopia Station along the way, nor was there a harbor known as Utopia in the Berserk Sea. The subsequent investigators didn't find any traces. The two cases didn't exceed the limits of Alfred's imagination. What surprised him was the criminal involved in the murder. Her name was Tracy. She was the owner of a hotel. She had received middle-class education and graduated from grammar school. After that, she became a mistress of a businessman. Recently, she was trying to free herself from this identity. This was identical to the owner of the Harbor Hotel, Tracy, that Alfred had met. Every detail matched. As a result, Alfred determined that the culprit behind the murder was Tracy, the beautiful woman who had received a certain degree of education, who was able to produce sad music in the middle of the night. Is this her backstory? Alfred muttered to himself silently. This made the residents of Utopia seem very realistic. It wasn't what Alfred had expected, an illusion. In other words, after the outsiders left, the inhabitants of Utopia continued to lead their own lives. They had their own love, hatred, pains, and sorrow. They had all sorts of experiences. Apart from Utopia seeming to not exist in the real world, it was similar to any ordinary town in the Lone Kingdom. Perhaps Utopia is real. Everyone there is real. However, if one wants to enter the town, they have to be in the right place at the right time. Alfred nodded indiscernibly and put away the investigation report he had received from MI9. To him, even if this matter ended here, he had no intention to investigate further. One had to know that, in the southern continent, there were countless bizarre incidents and phenomena. If one was too curious, it would only bring him greater danger than he imagined. After adjusting his clothes and mood, Alfred came to his father's study and knocked on the door with his curled finger. "Come on in." Earl Hall's voice rang out. Alfred tidied his blonde hair, pushed the door open, and sat down. Earl Hall smiled at him and said, "You're already a man." "No one would say such words to a man," Alfred replied without any reservations. "In my heart, you're still that rebellious youth," Earl Hall said with a smile. "You're already a Sequence 5 Beyonder?" Alfred replied with a double entendre, "Yes, I am a real knight." Earl Hall nodded and suddenly sighed. "You should have experienced a lot of hardship. From what I know, no matter if it's the potions or war, they will bring serious damage to people, from their bodies to their minds. Everyone undergoes a lot of pain in their lives," Alfred said with a sigh. He used a lone-styled euphemism. After a pause, he added, "Compared to when I left Backland, my present state is even better. As long as I grasp a method properly, I don't need to worry too much about the impact of the madness at my level." Earl Hall didn't continue on this matter and instead said, "Your sister has also become a Beyonder." "Oh." Alfred was shocked at first, but then he remembered something. He said with some annoyance, "I thought she just changed her hobby." "From the looks of it, Audrey's adventure had a little bit of your help," Earl Hall said, seemingly enlightened. "I hope you can talk to her about how dangerous, crazy, and painful it is about the sequence potions. Let her remain at her current level." Alfred replied without hesitation, "I'll do it." In the evening, in Audrey's small study room. "Alfred, why are you looking for me?" Audrey, who had changed into home clothes, led Susie and opened the door for her brother. She had been waiting for her brother for a few minutes. "I have something to warn you of." Alfred walked into the study and casually pulled a chair over. Audrey smiled and pointed at the golden retriever. "Do you need Susie to leave?" Alfred couldn't help but smile as he looked at the obedient golden retriever who was sitting by the side, her eyes filled with a look of sentience. "There's no need for that. I believe it won't eavesdrop on our conversation." Audrey casually corrected him. After the noble girl sat opposite him, Alfred sighed inwardly. After not seeing her for a few years, her younger sister was no longer as tender as before. Regardless of her looks or temperament, she had already reached a level that brought about amazement. She was no longer the little girl from the past. Alfred retracted his gaze and asked casually, "I heard that you became a Beyonder?" "Yes." Audrey nodded frankly. Alfred had originally planned on asking what sequence she was, but after some thought, he felt that it was too direct. It was easy for her to flare up, so he deliberated over his words and said, "You should be a Beyonder of the Spectator Pathway, right? The Rainbow Salamander has similar powers." The rainbow salamander was a gift from Alfred to his sister. After Audrey gave an affirmative answer, Alfred joked, "Can you do treatment in the mind domain now? Most Beyonders, including me, need help in this aspect." "Yes, I forgot to tell you that I'm already a Sequence 5 disciplinary paladin of the Arbiter pathway." Audrey pursed her lips and smiled. "I'm a qualified psychiatrist who has undergone professional training. You can verify this with father and mother." "She's already a Sequence 7? Alfred's expression gradually turned solemn. "Audrey, I have to remind you that the potions do not only bring about strength." Having said that, he paused and observed his sister's reaction. He realized that Audrey wasn't impatient at all and was listening very seriously. Every potion contains madness that can lead to a loss of control. I've seen similar situations before. More than once. They happen to my enemies, and they happen to my friends. No one is spared. Alfred amalgamated his experiences in East Balam and began explaining the dangers of the potion in detail. During this process, he realized that his sister, Audrey, wasn't the only one listening attentively. Furthermore, Susie, the golden retriever, appeared extremely quiet. Chapter 1334 Night with the Moon. MI9's office building was located on Bellato Street in West Borough, and it was an inconspicuous 3-story building. The entrance didn't show any signs of its identity. It simply hung a door sign, 9. The core of this office building was underground, and above it was for the clerks. Of course, most of the Beyonders who were under MI9 wouldn't go underground for no reason. The environment there wasn't good, and the atmosphere was oppressive. It was possible that an accident could happen due to the failure to watch over a sealed artifact. Zio was now the deputy team leader of the National Security and Counterespionage Team. She was in charge of a rather small-scale Beyonder team, responsible for handling espionage cases regarding Intis in the greater area of Backland. "There's a mission here." Her superior, MI9's deputy director, the team leader of the National Security and Counterespionage Team, Lieutenant General Pantek, picked up a document and handed it across the desk opposite him. "Is it very urgent?" Zio received it and asked cautiously. Lieutenant General Pantek was a typical lone old man with a case of severe hairline recession. He picked up a white porcelain coffee cup and took a sip. "Not at all. It's quite low risk. In fact, this mission will be sent to all members, hoping that someone will be able to complete it by luck." This description was out of Zio's expectations, but she didn't open the dossier on the spot and directly replied, "I will inform my team members." Zio returned to her own room after leaving Lieutenant General Pantek's office. When she threw herself into her seat, she seemed to have hidden herself. Zio quickly browsed through the documents in her hand and roughly understood why the deputy director said that. The utopia that needed investigation didn't seem to be anywhere in the northern and southern continent, nor were there on any of the known islands in the 5 seas. In the past 2 weeks, many people had entered the so-called utopia, but the way they entered was completely different. Some entered from the Berserk Sea's Sonia sea waters, arriving by a terrifying storm. Some were midway on a railway that led from Desi Bay to Backland. Due to a heavy storm, they had been delayed and stopped at the city. Others were in Civilaus County, and they entered because they were lost. Up to now, no one has been affected by the damage or mentally influenced. It's no wonder Deputy Director Pantek said that the danger level is very low. Also, there's no way to conclude the rules regarding the case, making it difficult for one to find the true location of Utopia. Therefore, there's no way for them to send people in to investigate. I can only tell all members of the situation, and hope that one of them will chance upon Utopia and carefully gather information in secret when they are there. Zio put down the documents in her hand and stood up regretfully, preparing to inform the Beyonders under her. She was regretful that the mission was so difficult that she almost couldn't see hope. This made her unable to accumulate more merit points. In the past half year, Zio had been very busy every day in order to deal with the pending apocalypse. As she dealt with MI9's matters, she completed all the missions Mr. Fool had given her, so as to accumulate contributions on both sides and exchange for the formula and Beyonder characteristics of the imperative mage formula and Beyonder characteristic, to fulfill the wish of becoming a demigod. And up till now, Zio was still lacking a little on both fronts, especially in MI9. If she didn't make any significant contribution, Zio couldn't see any hope. If not for the generous salary from MI9 and all kinds of benefits that came with it, and how she could rely on her status and identity to monopolize a large amount of information so as to help her complete the missions given by Mr. Fool, Zio yearned to resign and become a bounty hunter again. That way, she would have more freedom. I can ask about this case at the next tarot gathering. Perhaps Mr. World will have some clues. As Zio thought, she pushed open the door to the room where her team members were. After assigning the Utopia mission, Zio specially instructed, if the situation isn't right, even if you have the chance to enter Utopia, you can give up immediately. The town of unknown authenticity hasn't shown any danger. Perhaps it's because it hadn't been triggered. After busying herself for a while more, Zio finally ended her day in exhaustion. She returned home before 7:30, and she had dinner with her mother, her brother, and Furs. She enjoyed a limited amount of relaxation. At midnight, she washed up and walked to the bedroom window. She grabbed the curtain and prepared to draw it. During this process, Zio naturally cast her gaze outside and discovered that the crimson moon in the sky had already turned bigger at some point in time. Furthermore, the color had clearly deepened as though it was flowing blood. Zio suddenly turned her head and looked next door in concern. She was a little worried about her good friend's condition. However, she quickly recalled that Furs was a Sequence 4 demigod and no longer feared the effects of the full moon ravings. In the room next door, Furs was lying in bed, taking in the blood moon outside. As she endured the pain of her head being pricked by needles, she heard Mr. Door say, although going from Sequence 3 to Sequence 2 is indeed a qualitative change, going from an incomplete mythical creature to a real mythical creature, I believe that Sequence 4 to Sequence 3 has a qualitative change as well. It can even be said that Sequence 3 is the best level in a Beyonder pathway. At this level, there is no need to rely on external forces to resist the madness and the inclination towards losing control. There is no need to endure the torment every second and minute. They will also possess Beyonder powers that completely exceed that of an ordinary person. They will be more godlike than they are human. Furthermore, they can obtain a small number of anchors and stabilize their mental state. If not for the fact that most Sequence 3 Beyonders don't have long enough lives, with it being difficult for them to live to more than 500 years old, I believe there won't be many saints who have the motivation to advance to an angel. Yeah. Furs nodded, indicating that she had already understood. At the same time, her forehead twitched slightly and she yawned secretly. She was already a little accustomed to the pain from her direct conversation with Mr. Door. Mr. Door continued, the Apprentice Pathways Sequence 3 is Wanderer. This means that the spirit world can no longer trap you. You can enter the cosmos, travel the astral world, head to different planets, and see true dead silence, true barrenness, true magnificence, and completely different civilizations. Only after experiencing it for yourself will you understand how insignificant the world you live in is. Mr. Door briefly explained his experiences as a showcase of the magnificence and beauty of the cosmos, displaying the stateliness and charm of different civilizations. This made Furs fall into a trance. If not for the sharp throbbing pain in her head still reminding her, she would have even forgotten that the speaker was a dangerous king of angels. As long as you help me escape, I'll give you the potion formula and Beyonder characteristic of a wanderer and help you complete the ritual. Of course, this can be paid in advance. At the end of the full moon ravings, Mr. Door gave another promise. It really makes me look forward to it, Furs marveled sincerely. When Mr. Door's voice gradually weakened and disappeared, Furs suddenly pulled out the pillow at her waist and lay down. In less than 3 minutes, she fell asleep in peace. To her, the vast cosmos was indeed filled with charm. However, it also contained the danger of being corrupted just from knowing about it. She had no motivation to explore it. I'll consider it after touring all the places in the northern and southern continent and the 5 seas. In her sleep, Furs muttered almost silently to herself. At that moment, the blood-red moon outside the window had already faded. It returned to a light crimson color and wasn't full. A huge blood-colored moon hung on the edge of the cliff, illuminating the swamp below. The swamp was dark red and constantly bubbling, as though lava was boiling at the bottom of it. At a glance, there was no end to the swamp, like a vast ocean. Pa! A stone fell from the edge of the cliff and into the swamp. In the next second, a bubble appeared and silently burst, producing a blood-stained infant. The baby staggered, swam towards the cliff, and attempted to climb up. But the stone beneath Emlyn White's feet shattered as he fell off the cliff and into the swamp. This sanguine Earl suddenly jolted awake from his dream. He looked around in horror and confusion. After confirming that this was his room, where there were many extremely familiar dolls of different sizes, Emlyn slowly exhaled and said to himself with a rather solemn expression, "That dream wasn't simple." As a shaman king, he had a good understanding of a dreamscape. Could this be the so-called divine revelation? But I didn't receive any revelations. Emlyn thought for a few seconds but couldn't come up with an answer. Then he decided to ignore the problem and prepare to ask Father Yutravsky when he had the time. The incomplete moon that had its blood-red colors faded illuminated the garden of the Cathedral of Waves. Alger reached out his hand to grab the note delivered by the gale and read it. Verdú is looking for a pirate ship or a smuggling ship to Bansi. Bansi Harbor had yet been rebuilt, and there were no liners from all over the world that headed there. Verdú, who treasured his limited teleportation opportunities, could only rely on extremely normal methods. Head to Bansi? Alger immediately frowned. He knew what Bansi meant, but he didn't understand why Verdú wanted to go to Bansi. There should be nothing there. No, even if the church has leveled Bansi, there's still something abnormal about it. Furthermore, the church didn't investigate what problems Bansi had hidden in the past. As a cardinal, Alger was qualified to read through some confidential documents, including the records of the actions that the Church of the Lord of Storms had done when dealing with Bansi. In addition, he had also learned more from Mr. Fool and the World Gairman Sparrow. After some thought, Alger quickly came to a decision. He planned on getting his shadow guard to arrange a pirate ship for Verdú. In this aspect, Alger knew many key people to aid him. It didn't need him to show his face in person or use his name. Of course, smuggling ships in the Rørsted archipelago were often equivalent to pirate ships. Chapter 1335. I'm sitting on the chair in a police station, looking at the mouths of two men in black and white checkered uniforms opposite me. It's like they're talking about something. The man on the left has a cold expression on his face, as if he has been through too many unfortunate events. The man on the right is a little inexperienced, and there's a hint of pity in his eyes. I don't feel any pain, nor did I regret delivering that final stab. At that moment, I even felt that I had been liberated. The warm blood that sprayed on my body was like salvation from a god. I only regret my fervent pursuit of money in my youth. I had sacrificed my dignity, my body, and my freedom. Over the past few days at the police station, I've had enough peace and quiet. I had the opportunity to ponder this question at a deeper level, far deeper than whatever that I've been thinking about over the years. Me having a weak will and being immature were the source of the mistakes I made. But they weren't the only reason. Ever since I was a child, all the education I received told me that working and striving hard is for that big house, those full floor-to-ceiling windows that let in plenty of light, to have more than 3 servants, a lawn and garden that I can call my own, silver-plated or even gold-plated cutlery, be able to host a banquet filled with delicacies, run balls that were filled with melodious music, etc. The newspapers and magazines I'd read also told me over and over again that only those that showed a sufficient level of decency can be called middle class. They are the true pillars of support for this kingdom. They are people of high class, excellence, zero mediocrity, and integrity, while having compassion and knowledge. At the same time, they also told me what decency was. It's wearing a beautiful dress, matching expensive skincare products, cosmetics, and exquisite fashion handbags for different occasions. It was to attend concerts, high tea, and gatherings filled with class. And all of this translated means gold pounds, and gold pounds. I have to admit that pursuing a better life is instinctual for everyone. However, when the influences on a girl tells her in every aspect that, when the mainstream views of society are all about appearance, exquisiteness, and elegance, it's very difficult to not have her thoughts become influenced. I don't know what this phenomenon is called. I only know that if all of this can't be changed, then a tragedy like mine will continue happening more and more often. When that happens, someone would definitely curse. Look at these gold-digging women, selling out their souls. Subconsciously, I turn around and see the beautiful and bustling world outside. I see the bright red blood flowing in this world. Miss Tracy, are you listening to us? A voice distracts my thoughts, coming from the slightly inexperienced policeman. I grin at him, not telling him I'm thinking about some philosophical questions. What a joke! A gold digger who sold her soul is actually thinking of such inane matters when she's being interrogated by the police. The policeman nods and says to me, "Miss Tracy, you'll be put on trial soon. We'll arrange a lawyer for you." I'm sorry, we didn't manage to retain the witness. Just having his testimony isn't in your favor. It's okay, I say quietly to him. I will try my best to defend myself and repent for the crimes I have committed. I only hope that I can restart life anew. I think for a moment and curl the corners of my lips. I say to the two officers, "Can you borrow a few books from the library for me while I wait to go on trial?" Yes, phenomena of sociology and education. At that moment, I see the two police officers in a daze, and a hint of, yes, surprise. I sit at the far end of the model table and hear Miss Judgment describe the Utopia incident. After she finishes, I look around and hoarsely say, "This is a ritual." Unsurprisingly, I see Miss Judgment's gaze freeze. I can sense Mr. Hanged Man and Miss Justice looking over with a hint of speculation in their eyes. At this moment, I can almost guess what they're thinking. They definitely suspect that this is the World Gehrman Sparrow's Sequence 1 ritual. And they are already long aware from the talks in the tarot gatherings that the existence of a Sequence 0 true God makes it impossible for a Sequence 1 to exist. Regarding this matter, I have already prepared an explanation. It is to let them think about the ancient sun god and his 8 kings of angels. Unfortunately, no one raises any questions. They may have already made the connection to the kings of angels. Or perhaps they believe that the ritual involving Utopia is mainly to help Mr. Fool awaken further. I look at the lady who is lost in thought, and I ask after some deliberation, "Miss Tracy, where do your parents live?" "They've already passed away." The beautiful lady whose soul no longer belongs here replies with an ethereal voice. I lower my head and record it. "Do you have any other relatives?" The lady turns to look out the window and answers casually, "No." I exchange looks with my colleague and raise my voice. "Miss Tracy, are you listening to us?" The lady opposite me retracts her distant gaze and smiles at me. I don't know what she's thinking about. She's so quiet, like a flower blooming alone in the night. This analogy comes from an anthology of poems. My brother told me that reading poems makes me more charming. Of course, up till now, the poems have only brought mostly mockery. All of the police officers believe that it's worthless. When I tell the lady opposite me about the trial, I see a faint smile on her face as she pleads us to borrow a few books from the library, ones that I believe are difficult just from the title. The smile and the names of the book combine together into an indescribable beauty. After sending Miss Tracy back to the temporary detention room, I pack up the materials for the case and prepare to pay a visit to the lawyer. It's something that had been predetermined long ago. I lean back in my chair and listen to the moon Emlyn describe his dream. After Father Yutravsky's appraisal, this dream has been confirmed to have not originated from the Earth Mother. This inevitably makes people cast their looks of suspicion at the moon, towards a state prior to being corrupted by the mother goddess of depravity. I'm nearly amused by my own thoughts. As an experienced seer, a master at deciphering dreams, I'm not held back by modesty. I frankly reveal what I know. The 3 possibilities are that this dreamscape is trying to bait you into exploring and pursuing something. To a certain extent, it can interfere with your fate. Secondly, this dreamscape hopes that you can interpret it deeply and understand it. Then, through this, corrupt you in an indiscernible manner. Thirdly, You are too worried about the matter of becoming a beauty goddess, so you dreamed of that remarkably terrifying scene. The third possibility doesn't need elaborating on. The action needed for the first two possibilities are the same. Don't think about it, don't investigate. There's no need to leave Backlund. With that said, I see Emlyn nod without any hesitation. I know it's his way of handling things. A murder case? I browse the information on the case in my hand, and I use the changes in the tone of my voice to express my doubts. You should hire a senior lawyer. I'm just a solicitor, and strictly speaking, I don't have the right to represent anyone in court. Of course, this is only in the strictest of cases, but in reality, that never happens. As long as the case isn't too serious and doesn't involve the criminal courts, a solicitor can provide assistance to the court. The policeman in a black and white checkered uniform opposite me says with a smile, "Utopia is only a small city. We don't have senior lawyers, we'll have to hire them from elsewhere. Besides, this case is a case of self-defense. The sentence period will be very short, and the monetary aspect of this case doesn't even exceed £400. The trial can be done at the magistrate courts. When self-defense is deemed invalid, it'll be handed over to the criminal courts." He knows plenty. Is he planning on switching professions to become a lawyer? However, in normal circumstances, he still has to hand a homicide case that has unjustifiable self-defense to the criminal courts. Haha, this is the benefit of a small city. There are many things that aren't that strict. I think for a moment and reply tersely, "I'll try defending the client by claiming innocence. Also, please arrange for me to meet Miss Tracy as soon as possible." After flipping through the information from before, I'm already quite confident in this case. The biggest problem now is whether Miss Tracy's image can lead to the sympathy of others. Yes, although my solicitor license was forged from elsewhere, this cannot deny my professionalism. It just so happened that I made mistakes on that examination. Bansi? Verdu wants to go to Bansi? I sit at the bottom end of the long, mottled table and look at the hanged man who has reported to Mr. Fool. I have some doubts about the development of the matter. Verdu, who's engrossed in mysticism and is trying to save Mr. Dorr, does have certain reasons to search Bansi Harbor. Furthermore, he has stayed in Byam for almost half a year, so it's very normal for him to come into contact with information about Bansi. The main problem is that the hanged man's previous surveillance didn't provide any corresponding signs, making Verdu's actions seem a little out of place. The importance placed on this matter has to be raised. I nod inwardly and hear Mr. Fool instruct, "Continue monitoring." I play the 7-string guitar by the fountain in the municipal square. I use my knife and fork to slice the steak. In the cathedral, I describe the teachings of the goddess to the believers. I reach out my right hand and leave the carriage with the help of a gentleman. I get the new dress I had been eyeing for so long, and I can't wait to change into it. I stride forward with my forelegs as I'm being chased by a child. I laugh loudly as I totter about and play with a dog. Suddenly we tremble. We look up into the sky and see illusory, thin lines drilling out from our bodies. They extend to an infinite height, extending beyond the grayish-white fog. They extend into an ancient palace and land in the hands of a tall figure shrouded in fog. During this period of time, Klein's state had always been very strange, as though he had completely transformed into thousands of lives. Every clone had their own will, thoughts, knowledge, and fate. However, above this collective consciousness was a primary consciousness that held control. It constantly suffered all kinds of attacks, as though it could be assimilated by the sea of consciousness that had been formed autonomously at any moment. However, it eventually withstood the barrage of attacks, allowing Klein to maintain a certain level of clarity. His true body had been lying underground in St. Ariana Cathedral. His consciousness would occasionally rise and enter Sapphira Castle, and occasionally sink into his body. All the scenes that the marionette clones experienced constantly flashed in his mind like a dream formed from large amounts of fragments. Chapter 1336 Interaction Backlund Steam Locomotive Station, Platform 3. Alfred chatted with his parents and sister for a while before rushing to leave the train during the gap in between. He came to the platform and said to his squire, "Give me an East Balham cigarette." If the past few years had any negative impact on him, other than his mental suffering and pain, he still retained a few bad habits. After smoking plenty of East Balham cigarettes that consisted of spices and herbs wrapped in roasted tobacco leaves, Alfred was no longer used to the paper cigarettes that remained popular in the northern continent. He believed that they were bland and tasteless, as though they were liquor diluted with water. As for cigars, he felt that it needed a good environment to slowly savor it. It didn't suit his present situation. Of course, his smoking addiction wasn't too serious. A disciplinary paladin had a good enough constitution and spirit to resist such influences. Alfred came to the platform to smoke because he felt that it was too stuffy in the train carriage. Besides, his mother often raised the issue of him not being married. After the squire took it out and lit the East Balham cigarette, Alfred brought the stick that was nearly charred black to his mouth and sucked it deeply. The strong smell entered his body, causing his spirit to jolt. At that moment he saw a blonde-haired man who looked like a classic sculpture walking over with his valet. Alfred hesitated and smiled. He raised his right hand and said, "Hibbert, I thought you wouldn't be returning to Eastchester." It was Earl Hall's eldest son, Alfred's brother, Lord Hibbert Hall. Hibbert drew a perfect smile and said, "I'm just a cabinet secretary, not the cabinet chief secretary. I won't be so busy that I don't even have the weekend off." In fact, he had no plans on being a cabinet chief secretary either. His main goal was to accumulate experience at the various departments in the government and build up his own networks and resources to prepare for entering the House of Lords in the future. Alfred took another puff of the East Balham cigarette and smiled. "Happy weekend." After watching Hibbert enter the carriage, Alfred sensed that someone was looking over and was discussing. "Why aren't there any passengers waiting for that train carriage? It doesn't seem to be full." "Ah, that's a special carriage. It was pre-booked by an important figure for a large sum of money. I know that you might not have seen such a situation before, but you have to remember that this happens frequently in big cities like Backlund and Constant. When those important figures bring their entire family out, they will definitely have more than 100 servants follow. Perhaps there might even be pets, so how can they squeeze in a train carriage with ordinary people? Is that so? I wonder who is this big shot?" Alfred turned his head to look. There were dozens of people in gray-blue uniforms on Platform 2 who were quietly surveying Platform 3 across the empty tracks. The distance between the two parties wasn't small. If Alfred's hearing wasn't outstanding, he wouldn't be able to figure out what they were discussing. "They are." Alfred turned to ask his adjutant. He could only recognize that the uniform they were wearing belonged to a railway company. The adjutant turned around immediately and asked the staff at the platform. Soon, he jogged back and whispered to Alfred, "General, they're train dispatchers from all over the kingdom. They're undergoing short-term training in Backlund." Alfred nodded slightly and glanced at the Platform 2 again. The oldest of the train dispatchers had white hair and the youngest looked to be in their early 20s. Most of them were middle-aged men in their 30s or 40s with gray sideburns. In the Sonia C., City of Generosity, Byam, Verdu carried his luggage, which didn't contain many valuables, and boarded the boat at night. He left the harbor and boarded a pirate ship. As a Sequence 7 of the Apprentice Pathway, he wasn't very good at combat. And even though Verdu had a mystical item with him, he was rather afraid of its negative effects. He wasn't willing to use it unless it was critical to do so. Therefore, in order to avoid danger, he tried his best not to bring anything that would easily attract the greed of pirates which he didn't trust. The pirate on the deck glanced at Verdu and scoffed. "There's no need to be afraid. We always keep our promises. As long as you pay for the journey, we definitely won't throw you into the sea. Here, it'll be even safer than you taking a passenger ship. At least you don't have to worry about encountering pirates." Seeing Verdu silent as though he appeared somewhat afraid, the pirate gleefully threw a key to him. "The second floor on deck, the room at the end." Verdu caught the brass key and entered the cabin. He climbed up the stairs and headed down the corridor. This level seemed to be specially prepared for the people who boarded the pirate ship for various reasons. Along the way, Verdu encountered a few passengers that were totally unlike pirates. Among them was a street girl who was dressed rather scantily, a middle-aged man with a protruding belly and oily faces, an extremely cold young man wearing a cloak and a top hat. "Do you want to join me?" the lady smiled and asked when she saw Verdu looking over. She fluttered her eyes at him as she asked. It wasn't clear if she was planning to do some business on the trip, or if she was doing business while happening to make a trip. Verdu ignored her and withdrew his gaze before walking to his room. That well-defined and cold young man also stopped at the entrance diagonally opposite. "Backlund, West Borough, 9 Bellato Street. Come in." Zio straightened her body from the huge, wide seat. The door creaked open, and 2 MI9 members who were under Zio walked in. "Colonel, we've found some information regarding the investigation of Utopia." A man in a dark-colored jacket handed Zio a report. Zio was startled as she perked up. "What is it?" The man in a dark-colored jacket simply said, "In the past few days, we took advantage of the free time we had from completing our previous mission to visit all the passengers in Backlund from that particular steam locomotive through our informants." Without a doubt, he was referring to the steam locomotive that had stopped at Utopia. "Okay." Zio nodded and gestured for her subordinate to continue. The man in a deep jacket pointed at the report and said, "We have preliminary confirmation that none of the passengers that successfully arrived in Backlund show any abnormalities. They're in good spirits and have no problems with their memories. However, we discovered something. At that time, not everyone returned to the train. According to 2 passengers, their neighbors chose to remain in Utopia. One was a lady who loves traveling and exploration. She has a deep love for foreign places. After witnessing the outstanding red wine, desserts, and unique fizzling iced tea in Utopia, she decided to give up on her original plans and stayed in this small unique city for a while longer to discover even more wonderful things. The 2 passengers learned about this when they were chatting with her. Not only did they share neighboring seats, but they also chose to stay in the same hotel. They met in the morning. That hotel happened to be the same one our intelligence agent stayed in. It's called Iris's." Zio slowly nodded and said, "Have you investigated the lady's situation? What's her name?" "No, we can't be sure if she has left Utopia," answered the other MI9 member with a bushy goatee. "Those 2 passengers only know that lady's name is Monica, but they don't know her last name or background." Zio tersely acknowledged. "Your subsequent mission is to investigate this lady's background, find her family and friends, and confirm if she has returned." "Yes, Colonel." The 2 MI9 personnel saluted and left Zio's office. Zio read the report they had submitted and sighed silently. Compared to her subordinates, she was actually closer to the truth of Utopia. She already knew that it was a ritual that had a certain connection with Gehrman Sparrow. However, she had no way of reporting this news to her superiors for credit. Without mentioning the origins of the information, Zio needed to consider whether Gehrman Sparrow was willing to let this news leak out. "Perhaps I can try contacting Gehrman Sparrow and ask him for his opinion." Zio tidied her desk in thought and left MI9. After changing her clothes, she returned to East Borough and the Bridge area. She headed to different bars, just like back in her bounty hunter days, to gather all sorts of information from different people. During this process, she asked about Utopia in passing, but no one had heard of it. Finally, Zio entered a bar located in the Backlund Bridge area and sat on a high stool. She said to the bartender, "Anyone suspicious recently?" "A lot of people are suspicious, but they don't have any bounty," the bartender replied casually. Zio circled around this topic for more information, and when done, she asked according to plan, "Have you heard of Utopia?" "I've heard of it," the bartender replied as he wiped the glass. Zio moved her gaze from the bar counter up slowly. She looked at the bartender and asked, "Where from?" "There was a guest who came earlier, and he controlled his drinking," the bartender said indifferently. "I promoted our specialty cocktail to him. He said that he has other things to do, so he could only drink a glass of beer. I praised him and asked where he came from. He said, Utopia." Wendell had just finished his breakfast when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, he saw a police officer in a black and white checkered uniform standing outside. He opened the door in puzzlement. "Might I ask what's the matter?" Wendell asked politely. This house was a place he had been assigned to after coming to Backland. This was because he would be staying in this city for quite some time, receiving internal investigations and monitoring. The police officer was still young and a little inexperienced. He was only in his early 20s. He forced a smile and said to Wendell, "Hello, I'm Biles, a police officer. There's a case that requires you to provide testimony in court." "What case?" Wendell frowned slightly. The young policeman named Biles said with a polite smile, "It's the Tracy homicide case in Utopia." Wendell's eyes widened. Chapter 1337. A chain reaction. At that moment, Wendell felt his calves tremble slightly, as if he could no longer support the weight of his body. After leaving Utopia, he had anticipated the worst possible outcome, sudden death with no explicable reason. However, he never expected that he would meet someone from Utopia in Backland, a real large city. More importantly, the visitor had even invited him to Utopia. To Wendell, this was an extremely scary nightmare. Him not experiencing a mental breakdown could only be attributed to his good mental fortitude. Keeping his composure, Wendell forced a troubled expression and said, "I've had plenty of things to do recently." The police officer named Biles immediately said, "The trial will happen in 2 weeks. Here's the subpoena." As he spoke, he handed the document to Wendell. Frankly speaking, Wendell didn't want to accept it at all, but he had no choice but to accept it. Biles took a step back. "This concerns the future of a lady. I sincerely hope that you can testify in court." "It depends on the situation." Wendell didn't want to agree or refuse. Biles didn't say anything else as he bowed. "I'll wait for you in Utopia. I hope we meet again." With that said, he turned around and left the residence, entering the street. Throughout the entire process, Wendell seemed to have been frozen into an ice sculpture, standing there without blinking. After another 10 seconds, he finally woke up from his nightmare. He collapsed to the side weakly and held himself up by placing his right hand to the door. Just now, he had been so afraid that Biles would forcefully bring him back to the non-existent Utopia. If that happened, Wendell didn't know if he still had a chance to leave. Perhaps he would disappear forever. Compared to sudden death, this impossible-to-predict but clearly negative outcome left him even more fearful. "I need to quickly report this matter to the brass. Capture that policeman from Utopia and find out the real situation of this bizarre town and a suitable way to resolve the problem completely." Wendell snapped back to his senses and tried his best to perk himself up. He prepared to inform the MI9 members who were secretly monitoring him. At this moment, he finally realized that there was a huge problem with his response. He didn't grab the opportunity to inform his monitoring colleagues with a hand gesture that the police officer who had visited him was problematic. He didn't try to stall for time either. Instead, he waited for the monitors to realize that something was wrong. He also didn't show his talent as an intelligence agent, asking surreptitiously Biles which hotel he stayed in Backland and what day he was setting off by train. He was so terrified that he could only subconsciously use a response that wouldn't create an accident. With that thought in mind, Wendell walked out of the door and looked in the direction where Biles had left, but he didn't even see his figure. This police officer from Utopia had already blended into the carriages and pedestrians. Retracting his gaze, Wendell looked down at the subpoena in his hand and suddenly felt a little uneasy. What will happen if I don't go to Utopia to testify 2 weeks later? The more Wendell thought about it, the more scared he became. His calves weakened again, and he hurriedly made a hand gesture to inform his colleagues that were hiding around him of the anomaly. West Borough, 9 Bellato Street. After learning that a Utopia resident had arrived in Backland, Zio was both shocked and confused. According to her previous observations, Utopia was likely located in a secret location, or somewhere between real and illusory, allowing outsiders to enter through random entrances. As for why they wanted outsiders to enter, it was probably a ritual requirement. Therefore, according to Zio's understanding, the people of Utopia likely wouldn't leave their hometown and wander around. This is also a ritual requirement? What's the true identity of these residents? Mr. Fool's believers, the World Gehrman Sparrow's companions? After Zio asked about the general appearance of the Utopia visitor, she had no choice but to return to MI9's headquarters due to the lack of further information. She hesitated on whether she should send her subordinates to perform a large-scale search. She wasn't sure if Mr. World would be happy to see such actions being taken, and she was afraid of affecting the ritual. After pacing back and forth in the office, Zio prepared to pray to Mr. Fool and ask him to transfer her questions to the World Gehrman Sparrow. As she walked to the chair, Zio swept her gaze across the report placed on the table. It was an investigation report that her two subordinates had prepared. On the one hand, they had confirmed that there were no problems with the passengers that successfully arrived in Backland. On the other hand, they had pointed out that there were passengers who had remained in Utopia. Passengers. Zio's eyes narrowed as she made a guess based on her intuition. That Utopia inhabitants had their own goals in coming to Backland, and it wasn't for a random trip. And his goal is very likely related to a particular passenger who has left Utopia. Zio was alarmed as she hurriedly sat down and attempted to pray. Just then, someone knocked on her office door. "Please come in," Zio said after some hesitation. As the door opened, Zio saw the goateed Locke and Wendell, who was in charge of the Utopia incident. "Colonel, Wendell met someone from Utopia. He paid him a visit directly," Locke said, fumbling over his words. This development was equally unexpected. Indeed, Zio wasn't surprised. Instead, she secretly heaved a sigh of relief. She looked at Wendell and asked, "Why did he visit you?" "He requested that I head to Utopia to testify about the homicide case I mentioned in my report." Wendell was clearly calmer than before. He then added, "He's a policeman. Name's Biles. I don't dare ask where he was living. I don't know when he's planning to leave or which steam locomotive he's planning on taking to leave." To express the weight she had on this matter, Zio stood up and thought. "Locke, summon your team members to look for the rental carriage drivers who often prowl for customers around Wendell's residence, as well as the carriage drivers who passed by the nearby district, and ask if they've seen Biles before. If they have seen him, ask them where he was sent to. Also, send someone to the steam locomotive station and wait by the entrance to observe the passengers." After instructing her subordinates, Zio turned to look at Wendell. "Cooperate with them and sketch out Biles." "Yes, Colonel," Locke and Wendell replied in unison. After they left and closed the door, Zio sat back down and began to pray. Soon, she received Mr. Fool's response and saw the World Gehrman Sparrow praying in the gray fog. Gehrman Sparrow told her, "You can carry out normal investigations. When necessary, you can suggest that it's a ritual, but it must be included among a few options." Zio immediately heaved a sigh of relief as she patiently waited for her subordinates to report the results of their investigations. As night fell, Locke returned to Bellato Street and reported to Zio, "We found the rental carriage driver that took the Utopian's business." "Oh." Zio showed her concern. Locke explained simply that Utopian originally got the carriage driver to go to the dock area. However, as soon as the carriage entered the corresponding area, he requested to get off, saying that they had arrived. That street was very unfamiliar to the carriage driver, making him feel like he was lost. After leaving that street, he realized that his surroundings had become familiar. Our men accompanied him to that place again, but he couldn't find that street no matter what. Zio nodded slightly and said solemnly, "It matches our preliminary descriptions regarding the entrances and exits of Utopia." "Colonel, are you saying that one can enter or leave Utopia from any city and street?" Locke was in disbelief. Zio thought for a moment before saying, "From the looks of it, yes. But I have a feeling that there's something wrong." "How does Utopia connect to different places? What does it rely on?" As her voice trailed off, Zio said to Locke, "Tell Wendell that he'll spend the following 2 weeks here until that subpoena expires." "Yes, Colonel." Locke turned around and left Zio's office. Wendell didn't have any objections to Colonel Daricha's arrangements. He could even say that he would only feel safe inside MI9's headquarters. His temporary residence was a simply refurbished duty room. Through the window, he could see the lawn, garden, and trees outside. At a glance, Wendell saw a pitch-black raven standing on a tree branch, silently looking over. Night in Bansi was abnormally creepy. From time to time, the cries of ravens or other seabirds could be heard. Verdu stood at the window, watching the approaching dilapidated dock and the city that had already been reduced to ruins. The pressure in his heart grew. After a few days at sea, the ship he boarded was about to reach Bansi harbor. The captain had already informed Verdu in the morning that they would only wait for 2 hours. If he exceeded the 2 hours, Verdu could only wait for the next ship on this deserted island. Who knew when the next ship would come? After taking a deep breath, Verdu retracted his gaze and took off his coat. Then he opened his suitcase, took out a classic black robe and put it on. The surface of the robe was embroidered with golden and silver threads, and there were many gems the size of rice grains attached to it. It was a sealed artifact of the Abraham family. After making preparations, Verdu left the pirate ship and entered Bansi harbor. Along the way, the ancient robe tightened, causing his face to turn purple as he nearly fainted. As they walked, Verdu found the spot where the telegraph office stood based on the map he had bought. In the middle of the rubble, there were 2 bloody red marks, ones that remained fresh. It was as if they were left behind after 2 people were crushed into minced meat. Beside the 2 figures, on a broken wall, there was an octopus-headed monster wearing armor. It stood on waves and was holding a trident. Verdu raised the lantern in his hand high and was about to take a closer look when he suddenly felt a drop of cold liquid land on his neck. Gripped with terror, he subconsciously reached out his hand. He found it sticky, nothing like rain. It was colorless. Not blood. It's a little similar to saliva. Verdu's forehead twitched slightly and he slowly raised his head to look at the place where the drop of liquid could have dripped from. It was a swath of pitch black. It was the night sky without the moon or stars. Chapter 1338 Exploration. Verdu subconsciously swallowed his saliva, feeling an indescribable sense of fear. He didn't know what he was afraid of. There wasn't any real danger, yet a drop of unknown liquid falling from above was enough to chill his spine and tighten his pores. Perhaps it was because the environment was too eerie and silent, or perhaps it was because of the identity and unknown origins of the liquid. Verdu cautiously moved 2 steps outside and patiently observed. In the next few minutes, nothing abnormal happened. No more liquid fell from above. This made Verdu suspect that it was only a bird passing by. There was a freshwater fish from the island streams or a sea fish in its mouth and a slightly sticky liquid dripped from its surface. He calmed himself and then checked on the ruins of the telegraph office. 10 minutes later, Verdu confirmed that there were only traces of blood and simple murals that were related to mysticism. It was worth researching. He didn't rashly extract samples of the blood-colored soil or make copies of the strange mural. Instead, he took out a pure, dreamy crystal ball from his pocket. As an astrologer, he naturally had to use his best techniques to confirm if he should take action. Holding the crystal ball in his left hand, his right hand touched the top of the crystal ball as Verdu entered the state of an astrologer. In the next second, the crystal ball shone brightly. Bang! It exploded and scattered shards in every direction. Verdu's gaze froze. He stood rooted to the ground, completely ignoring the pain brought to him by the shards piercing into his body. It exploded, it actually exploded, he muttered to himself in disbelief. The crystal ball shards that stabbed into his body didn't seem to break through the classic robe. At that moment, they fell without any blood on them. Of course, there were a few shards left on Verdu's jaw and face, peppering them with small wounds. Who is it? Verdu suddenly came to his senses and turned to face another direction. In the ruins opposite him, a figure walked out. It was the woman in scantily clad clothes from the pirate ship. She had hidden herself very well and wasn't discovered by Verdu. However, the explosion from the crystal ball gave her a fright and made her react excessively, causing her to fail to maintain her hidden state. Verdu's injured face immediately twisted. "Why are you here?" The lady curled her lips and put on an indifferent attitude. "This is Bansi Harbor, not your home. Why can't I be here? I felt bored and came down to take a stroll, hoping to pick up some jewelry from the ruins. Is there any problem with that?" She retorted with a few questions without any intention of distancing herself from Verdu. Verdu didn't argue with her. He took out the medicine and medical alcohol that he had prepared beforehand and treated his facial and chin injuries. He then pulled out the crystal ball shards and put them back into his pocket. He didn't want his blood to remain in such a strange place. Following that, Verdu pulled on an accessory on the classic robe. It was a door-shaped symbol formed from 3 rubies, 3 emeralds, and 3 diamonds. In an instant, the long robe tightened, accentuating the flesh on Verdu's body. Just as Verdu's bones were about to be crushed, his figure gradually faded and he disappeared. Then he teleported to the coastal mountain outside Bansi Harbor. The mountain had collapsed and turned into rubble. According to what Verdu knew, this was once the place where the Bansi residents used to worship the god of weather. It was also the main target of the Church of Storms. After the crystal ball exploded to warn him that the Bansi telegraph office was hiding an unknown danger, Verdu didn't dare to continue exploring the area or search for mysticism materials. He could only forcefully move to the next location. And this allowed him to escape the woman's tailing. As soon as Wilder's figure appeared, he bent down and took a deep breath. It was as if he had finally recovered from his suffocating state. At the same time, Verdu felt a sharp pain in his right rib, as if a bone had fractured. After taking several deep breaths, he endured the pain and walked a few steps forward with sweat on his forehead, arriving at the altar marked on the map. Without a doubt, the altar had been destroyed. There was only a glassified, slightly charred crater. There was gravel with different shapes scattered around it. The gravel had traces of being engulfed in fire and lightning to various degrees. After Verdu Abraham surveyed the area, he raised his right hand and waved his sleeve. With a whoosh, a small portion of the gravel was pushed away from the spot, revealing the ground beneath it. This was a trickmaster's wind trick. Verdu used it to replace the need for manual labor to fully ensure his safety. As the gravel flew, Verdu saw the charred ground. There were a few parts left in some areas that had extremely incomplete patterns, drawings, and symbols. The sound of the wind grew more intense as it resonated in Verdu's ears, causing him to look up in surprise. The wind that could only blow small gravel had somehow turned into a hurricane. It even pushed him into a state of staggering about. Wild clouds gathered in the sky, as if a storm was brewing. Although he had heard that Bansi was a weather museum, he had never thought that the changes would happen so suddenly. For a split second, Verdu suspected that his wind trick had triggered a storm, or perhaps it had caused some changes to the cleared ruins of the altar. This guess made his forehead break out into a cold sweat. As the storm raged, Verdu saw the rubble in front of him fly up, revealing a boulder that was buried underneath. The surface of the boulder was crisscrossed with deep cracks, giving off a feeling that it would shatter once it was touched. At this moment, the wind had calmed down, but the heavy rain was still brewing. Thinking about how he was already in Bansi Harbor and couldn't afford to be scared off just like that, he mustered up his courage and approached the boulder covered in charred black cracks. He then took out a magnifying glass that was engraved with strange patterns, and he seriously checked the state of the boulder. 7 to 8 minutes later, Verdu put away the magnifying glass, a mystical item, and sighed in regret and dismay. He had already confirmed that there was nothing wrong with the boulder. It didn't involve anything related to mysticism. Verdu was about to retract his gaze and leave when he suddenly saw that at the interface of the boulder's bottom and the earth, bright redness seeped out. The bright redness gradually expanded, like blood flowing out. However, it didn't spread into a huge area. It was limited to a very small area. The 2 blood-red figures in the telegraph office's ruins instantly flashed across Verdu's mind. His scalp couldn't help but tingle. His lips quickly turned dry as he instinctively thought that this wasn't a good development. After swallowing another mouthful of saliva, Verdu raised his right hand and created another gust of wind, causing quite a number of miniature rocks to roll over to fill the bottom of the boulder completely, covering up the bright redness that seeped out. He didn't stay here any longer. He forced himself to activate teleportation again and headed for his final destination. This time, another one of his ribs fractured again, causing him to almost faint from the pain. In addition to the suffocation caused by the tightening, Verdu felt like he was hovering around the edge of death. He took several seconds to recover and cast his gaze forward. This place was also in ruins. A collapsed house covered the weeds. According to a pirate who had once explored the ruins of Bansi, there was an item here worth researching. It was an ordinary wooden door, but it was the only thing that remained intact in Bansi. The pirate didn't find anything special about the wooden door, so he got his subordinate to carry it in an attempt to move it back to the ship. However, they had only taken 2 steps when they suddenly collapsed. Dragging their spines, their heads separated from their bodies and rolled to the side. This frightened the pirate. He didn't dare to stay any longer and led the rest of the crew away in a hurry. Verdu didn't fully believe the story that the other party had told him. Although he hadn't experienced much life at sea, he knew that the sailors liked to exaggerate, often exaggerating something several times. However, even if it was an exaggeration, Verdu believed that the door was worth studying. After a round of searching, he discovered his target. The ordinary-looking wooden door was leaning against a collapsed wall with brass locks and handles. There were no corpses around it, nor were there any traces of blood. It was identical to the majority of the ruins. Indeed, he's exaggerating. Perhaps the pirate heard about this wooden door from somewhere else. Both he and his subordinates didn't dare to move it. Verdu looked around and suddenly said, "Who is it? Why are you monitoring me?" He actually didn't notice anyone around him, but based on his experience and lessons, he could use words and a reaction to deceive the possible presence of a monitor. A second later, a middle-aged man with a belly appeared in the shadows. He said nothing and silently left the place. Verdu heaved a sigh of relief as he didn't waste any time to approach the wooden door. According to the information he had obtained, no matter which way he opened the wooden door, it wouldn't bring about any abnormal changes. There would be no danger if he didn't attempt to move it. After thinking for a few seconds, Verdu retracted his hand into his sleeve and used his classical robe as a glove to pull the wooden door up. He raised the wooden door, and the surroundings fell silent. Verdu pushed the wooden door like he was normally opening a door, but there were no changes. He tried many other methods, but he failed to make the wooden door display any abnormalities. It seemed to have just been lucky to be preserved in its entirety under the bombardment of the Church of the Lord of Storms. Taking a deep breath, Verdu tried to calm himself down. He thought for a moment and tried to open the door again. However, unlike before, he held the handle and gently twisted it down. After hearing the light click of metal colliding, Verdu pushed the wooden door backward and let it lean against a collapsed wall. This time, a grayish-white fog appeared before Verdu. In the fog, there was a faintly discernible street and a row of terraces. Outside one of the houses, there was a wooden signboard. On them were a few Loanese words, Bansi Harbor Telegraph Office. While Verdu's pupils dilated, a calm voice sounded from the telegraph office that was shrouded in fog. "Are you here to send a telegram? Please come in." Chapter 1339. Behind the door. Although the voice coming from the telegraph office wasn't anything out of the ordinary, it was just a little intermittent. It lacked the obvious changes in tone. Normally, it wouldn't strike terror in others, but Verdu's heart suddenly erupted with a surge of fear. It was like a bullet with flames shooting into an ammunition dump. It accurately hit a barrel of flammable gunpowder and ignited the fear that Verdu had accumulated and suppressed previously. The horror that swept into every corner of his body was like a hand that grabbed Verdu's heart and blanked out his brain. He turned around abruptly and ran frantically towards the remnant pier where the pirate ship was. During this process, Verdu had completely forgotten to think. He didn't remember wearing a classic robe that could teleport. All he did was run through the ruins with his feet, occasionally tripping over random items and falling heavily to the ground. Sometimes, his face would turn purple from his tightening clothes, and he had no choice but to stop to catch his breath. However, every time he composed himself a little, he would crawl up and continue running. He looked like he had lost his rationality and was acting purely on instinct. Without the force he provided, the wooden door couldn't maintain its balance. It slid down from the collapsed wall and fell to the floor covered with bricks. The grayish-white fog and the shadowy houses disappeared. After 5 minutes, Verdu ran back to the pier under the storm. His eyes were wide open, filled with panic and confusion. He didn't notice that there was a figure standing on the deck of the pirate ship, quietly looking down at him. This was the young man wearing a half-top hat and a long black trench coat. He had a cold expression. Verdu didn't even think about it and immediately used the gangway to return to the pirate ship. He rushed into the cabin and rushed to the second floor before rushing into his room. Bang! He slammed the door shut and curled up on the small, narrow bed. He wrapped himself tightly with the blanket and shivered. When another of his ribs fractured again, the excruciating pain struck him and he finally recovered from his horror. He realized that his limbs were sore and his body was hot. Every breath he took was like thunder. He struggled with all his might, and finally, he took off his classic robe and fell back into the bed. He felt dizzy and nauseous. The air just felt insufficient. Outside the cabin, the cold-looking man suddenly raised his hand. He took out a human-skinned glove and wore it on his left palm. Suddenly, the man vanished into thin air and appeared in a corner of the ruins. He appeared beside the ordinary wooden door. He bent down and raised the wooden door, allowing it to stand in front of the collapsed wall. Right on the heels of that, the man in the black trench coat mimicked Verdu's actions. He reached out for the handle and twisted it downwards. Then, he pushed the wooden door forward and let it lean against the wall. Almost at the same time, he saw a grayish-white fog. He saw the faintly discernible streets and houses in the fog. Amidst the houses, the clearest, most eye-catching one was the Banksy Harbor Telegraph Office. The rest were more or less blurry. At this moment, the calm voice in the telegraph office asked through the door, "Who are you?" "German Sparrow," the young man in a half-top hat replied in the same staccato. The interior of Banksy Harbor Telegraph Office suddenly fell silent as though someone was walking silently towards the door. At that moment, German Sparrow turned his head to the other side. In the deep end of the street, a figure walked over. He was wearing a straw hat and had a towel around his neck. He was bending over to pull something. As the figure approached, the outline of the object behind him gradually became clear. It was a black vehicle with 2 wheels. It had a roof that could block the scorching sun and rain. In the vehicle sat a lady wearing a waist-length dress with an embroidered fan. Both she and the driver were concealed by thick fog, making it difficult for anyone to see their exact appearances. When they passed German Sparrow, he barely managed to see a few details through the fog. The hunched man pulling the carriage had a rotten face with pale yellow pus flowing. In areas where the lady wasn't covered by the fan and clothes, her skin was swollen with a glisten amidst many blue and black spots. With a ring, a bell sounded. A blue train with 2 carriages sped out from in front of German Sparrow. At this moment, German Sparrow realized that there was an iron-black track on the ground. Above him were long lines. On the top of the train carriage, there was a rather complicated metal frame that slid over the long lines. Through the glass window of the train, German Sparrow saw the passengers inside. They faced the streets, but only their heads remained. Each head was dragging a bloody spine. German Sparrow's pupils dilated as he silently watched this scene without moving for a long time. After nearly a minute, he took a step forward in an attempt to enter the blurry street beneath the grayish-white fog. However, the fog blocked him. No matter what method he used, he couldn't pass through it. 15 minutes later, German Sparrow stopped his attempts and closed the wooden door, eliminating the fog. Then, he dragged the wooden door and teleported directly to the pirate ship. He wasn't worried about being cursed at all. He then placed the wooden door on the deck and reached out his left hand again to grab the door handle. Suddenly, there was a cracking sound from German Sparrow's neck. His head seemed to be raised by an invisible hand as it dragged out a bloody spine. German Sparrow's expression didn't change as he coldly raised his right hand and pressed it above his head, pressing his head back to its original position. Immediately after, he turned the handle as though unaffected and pushed the wooden door open again, allowing it to lean against the shipboard. However, this time, there was no grayish-white fog to be seen, nor were there any visible streets, houses, or trains. It could be said that there was nothing unusual. In the next second, the wooden door rapidly decayed, turning into a pile of mud, as if it was trying to avoid the fate of being tested. Gehrman Sparrow didn't stop it. He took out a golden ring embedded with a ruby and wore it for nearly 10 seconds. After the ring vanished, Gehrman Sparrow reached out with his right hand and pulled out the same ordinary wooden door from the void before continuing his attempts. After confirming that the wooden door would lose its effects once it left Bansi, Gehrman Sparrow casually waved his hand, allowing it to vanish in midair. 2 hours later, the dark clouds in the sky gradually dissipated. The storm that had been brewing for a long time ultimately did not descend. When the pirate ship was far away from Bansi Harbor, Verdu, who had finished treating his injuries, took a bottle of medicine and allowed himself to quickly fall asleep so that he could adjust his mental state. In the hazy dream world, he ran in a desolate moor, looking for something frantically, but he found nothing. Suddenly, Verdu heard a faint voice coming from deep in the moor. The great Thor, the symbol of iron and blood, the ruler of chaos and strife. This sentence repeated over and over again, but it didn't alarm Verdu enough to snap him out of his dreams. After some time, Verdu woke up and opened his eyes. At that moment, the morning sun shone into the cabin outside the window, bringing with it a faint light. Verdu slowly sat up and realized that he didn't need to use the powers of an astrologer to recall the 3 lines of the honorific name that he had heard in his dream. And his relatively rich mysticism knowledge told him that it was referring to a hidden existence at the level of a deity. Is this the result of the incomplete symbols and labels around the altar, or a result of me witnessing that street in the grayish-white fog? Verdu frowned and fell into deep thought. He didn't rashly attempt to recite that honorific name, because he knew how miserable people who had done something like that had died. Verdu vaguely remembered that he had seen this deity's name in a book in his family. He decided to do some research before considering how to deal with it later. Bansi Harbor, on the collapsed coastal mountain. Red, blazing white, or orange flames emerged from the crevices of the gravel, forming a figure. This figure was wearing a black blood-stained armor, with a half-grown fiery red hair. He looked young and handsome. There was a blood-colored mark on his glabella that resembled a flag. There were traces of decay on his face. It was none other than the Red Angel evil spirit, Saron Einhorn Medici. He didn't have Sapphira Castle and an attendant of mysteries characteristic to allow his marionettes to run around the world without considering the limitations of distance. I wouldn't need to take such a roundabout route. The Red Angel evil spirit Sked, a mystery as to who was speaking with. In midair, a raven landed on the top of a boulder. There was a circle of white on its right eye, and a human voice sounded from its mouth. You actually used him and not him. This isn't like your style. The Red Angel evil spirit chuckled. That's because he wishes others to call him as him and not him. As he spoke, Saron Einhorn Medici glanced at the raven. This form of yours looks cuter than your true self, don't you think? The raven? The white-eyed raven replied without any hint of anger, your mockery is just like you. Still living in the previous epoch. The Red Angel evil spirit smiled and said, the developments have been rather smooth, and has been fooled. However, I believe that even if he discovers it, it will probably turn a blind eye. For the two of you to become great old ones, Dor has to return. The hypocritical him might still be hesitating about whether to do it, because if he isn't careful it will bring about a huge disaster. I like disasters. The raven, when are you going to make your payment? If you don't have enough strength, I won't be able to gain the trust of the brainless Abraham. When he prays to you, said the white-eyed raven, if you're worried that such a state won't last long, I can parasitize a worm of time into your body and help you maintain it. There's no need to thank me. As he spoke, the raven spread its wings and disappeared into the vast night sky. The Red Angel evil spirit turned his head and, with the advantage of the terrain, wore a solemn expression as he looked down at the Bansi ruins. Chapter 1340 Travel Diaries. This small city called Utopia is intrinsically no different from the ones I had been to in the past. Be it the folk culture, the people, or architectural style, it follows very closely to the standard Lone styles. I've heard that the southern continent has many peculiar and unusual traditions. I hope that I can experience it myself one day. Of course, that's after East and West Balam's peace is restored. Speaking of which, the most special thing about this place is that the weather is always changing and there's always a storm. As a result, most people have umbrellas and raincoats that are smeared with Donningsman tree sap. The hotel attendant told me that for a person of a certain income level, which also has a need to work outdoors, they would have to save quite a sum of money to purchase a raincoat. Otherwise, the sickness would only take more away. There are no meteorologists here. I have no idea why there are so many changes in the weather here. I can only guess that it has something to do with it lining the sea and being close to places with hurricanes. Yes, there's a deep water harbor a few kilometers away from Utopia. However, they're lacking in manpower and it isn't very well managed. It can only maintain its operations on a small scale. They don't have local newspapers either. After all, it's just a small city with a few thousand people. The paperboys mainly sell the Tussock Times, Desi Mirror, and Siwan News. The second reason I like this place is because many people in Utopia are optimistic and are very enthusiastic about life. When I wrote this down, a band happened to pass by outside the hotel. It's not a professional band, but a group formed purely from amateur enthusiasts. Among them, there are civil servants, law enforcement officers, solicitors, professional policemen, school teachers, candy factory workers, shop owners. Among them, those with the money are responsible for the larger musical instruments, such as cello, violins, and other difficult musical instruments. The lower and middle-class citizens use relatively simple instruments like 7-string guitars and harmonicas. On some rest days, they will walk the streets and set off from the municipal square. They will circle the city before returning to the St. Ariana Cathedral near the square. They call this a musical tour. In the tour, not only do they not reject other citizens from joining, but they even encourage them to sing or dance along with the procession. According to my observations, the participants are very happy and very satisfied as they freely express their love for life. This gives me a feeling of being full of vigor. I have to admit that it's very infectious. I've tried to join the tour, and I've forgotten my troubles in the revelry of music, dancing, and singing. I only remember happiness. They aren't on a tour today. Instead, they're showering their blessings to a newlywed couple at the cathedral. Speaking of weddings, what I don't understand the most is that it only has the Evernight Goddesses Cathedral. One ought to know that in most of the kingdom, even in a small town, there would be at least 2 cathedrals, one belonging to the Evernight Goddess and the other, the Lord of Storms. Before today, I couldn't imagine that an ordinary town in the kingdom would only believe in one deity. However, this doesn't cause too much trouble for me. Before I turned 18, I could only believe in the Lord of Storms under the influence of my family. However, after I graduated from grammar school, I came to truly understand that the goddess is the most compassionate and benevolent deity. Back to the wedding, I participated in a wedding a couple of days ago. I discovered that Utopia has some special customs in this area. Out of all of them, what I admire the most is that when the priest pronounces them man and wife, the groom and bride will bow to each other. No one is superior in this relationship as they only sincerely express their gratitude to be able to spend the rest of their lives together. This might be an expression of equality between man and woman in the goddess's teachings. In addition, there will be some special game segments after the wedding. For example, let the groom and the bride publicly describe their love story. This may be a rather embarrassing matter for them, but to the guests, it's rather interesting. Yes, I think so too, but I definitely won't add similar segments to my wedding. At the wedding, I heard the best love story I've heard so far. If there's a chance, and if you my dear readers of this particular column enjoy it, I'll consider retelling it. Of course, I'll change the names and some details to prevent the couple from feeling troubled. The most important reason why I like Utopia is its food. The food here is very delicious. The limited number of restaurants are all very good, and the best is undoubtedly the attached restaurant to the Iris's hotel I'm staying at. Be it the most basic beef steak, fried pig chop, charcoal barbecued meat, spiced fried fish, or even more complicated, more difficult stewed mutton with peas, thick cream soup, butter potatoes, and roasted potato skin, all of them have reached the level of a master chef in the city. In addition, the chefs here are quite skilled in creating unique dishes and food. There are sweet and sour meat cubes, and grilled fish smeared with various condiments. In the staples that don't seem to allow for experimentation, the chefs of Utopia haven't given up. I've eaten all kinds of toasts in this city: yam, potatoes, butter, creamed, and ones with fruits. As long as I was willing to, I could make it so that I don't eat the same thing twice during the week. The best food of praise here is their desserts. Cream pudding, fruit pudding, black forest cakes, carrot cakes, milk cakes, muffins, egg tarts. I feel hungry writing this. This is the reason why I still don't wish to leave after staying here for a week. What I'm most worried about now is not my wallet but my weight. I'm glad that the hotel doesn't have a weight scale, and at the same time, I blame them for not including one. The red wine in Utopia is also rather outstanding. The only problem is that they lack the age to settle down. It seems like the vineyards around the city haven't realized this. Here, I need to seriously recommend a drink: Utopia's fizzling iced tea. It's very special, and it has an even more amazing experience besides the sweetness and bubbles. Every night, I would go for a stroll in the municipal square. That's also the place where most Utopians like to go for entertainment. They have an extraordinary love for the pigeons. I met an artist at the municipal square. His name is Anderson. He's handsome, and his artistic skills are superb. Unfortunately, he's a mute. I also know another writer. His name is Alzu. It's a rather strange name. He said that he's writing a long novel and asked me to appraise the beginning. I won't comment on his novel, but I was just curious about a few familiar names at the beginning of the novel. It included Anderson, Wendy. Oh yes, this is the boss of my favorite bakery. I raised this question, and Alzu told me very seriously that when a writer can't think of names for characters, it's very reasonable for them to use someone they know as reference. I agree. Since this column is too narrow to contain my thoughts, I'll end it here. Love, Charlotte. Monica put down her fountain pen and seriously read the manuscript twice. She changed certain words and any grammatical errors. She was a writer. She wasn't famous at first, so she could only rely on writing third-rate romance novels to maintain her life. After she changed her faith to the Evernight goddess, her father had almost cut off all ties with her. However, ever since Miss Furs Wall, who had written Stormwind Mountain Villa, established a travel column, and had received quite a warm response after the war, Monica had also started to write about her travels in some Backlund newspapers. This perfectly matched her hobby, and her hobby gave her a unique vitality to help her become a famous travel columnist. Charlotte was her pen name. After her writing dried completely, Monica specially wrote another copy and stuffed it into an envelope before affixing it with a stamp. After confirming that the address was correct, the black-haired lady with a Desi Bay style carried her handbag and left the hotel, heading to the Utopia post office. The post office was next to the telegraph office. Whenever Monica passed by the latter, she would always find it a waste. From her point of view, Utopia rarely needed to send telegrams. It was too extravagant to specially build a telegraph office. After sending the letter, Monica looked at the sky and walked towards the municipal square. When she arrived at the entrance of St. Ariana's Cathedral, she met Biles. He was a police officer. He had once questioned Monica at the Iris's hotel due to the homicide witness. Unfortunately, Monica didn't know that man named Wendell. After greeting each other with a nod, Monica entered the cathedral and found a seat. She listened quietly to the sermon of the priest named Townsend. This was a priest she found to be most clergyman-like ever since she changed her faith to the Evernight goddess. His hair was half white and he spoke slowly and mellowly. His voice was deep and low, always calming down people without them realizing it. Monica closed her eyes and listened attentively to the sermon. East Chester County, in a forest belonging to the Hall family. Alfred, Hibbert, and Audrey led their respective foxhounds with their servants around the forest and chased after their prey. This was the first time the three of them had hunted together since they became adults. In front of their sister, Alfred and Hibbert had a great time, at least on the surface. And to Alfred, the biggest problem was how to control himself and not show that he was too extraordinary. Otherwise, if a disciplinary paladin were to join the hunt, no one else would have the chance. He knew that his sister was a Beyonder, but he also knew that a Sequence 7 Beyonder of the Spectator pathway didn't have any actual combat ability. As they chased their prey, they rushed out of the forest and saw a wheat field. "Where are we?" Audrey, dressed in hunting gear, asked casually. This was her first time hunting in this forest, and she didn't know where it led to. Hibbert wasn't too familiar with the area as well. He turned his head and said to his attendant, "Ask someone." As they waited, the three siblings laughed as they discussed their trophies. As for the golden retriever, Susie, she glanced at the foxhounds that wanted to get close to her and made them distance themselves. After a while, Hibbert's attendant returned and reported, "Sir, there's a village called Heartlark nearby." "Heartlark? That village with the dragon worship customs? I came here from somewhere else?" Audrey was taken aback when she heard that. Chapter 1341. In the dream, after regaining her senses, Audrey maintained her faint smile as she became wary. She could vaguely feel a mysterious force pushing her to Heartlark, the village with the tradition of dragon worship. This was like an arrangement of fate. Audrey had once entered the Hall of Truth, and she discovered that the murals inside had turned into reality. Furthermore, she knew that the Spectator Pathway's Sequence 1 was author. From this name, she had made some connections, so it was inevitable for her to suspect that something was amiss. At this moment, Hibbert laughed. "I've heard of this village. I remember that our family has a manor nearby." As he spoke, he looked up at the sky. "It's almost evening. Why don't we stay there and continue hunting tomorrow?" Alfred wasn't opposed to his elder brother's suggestion. To him, staying the night at whichever manor was essentially the same. He nodded and said, "Send someone back to inform father and mother." Audrey didn't say a word. Her green eyes turned slightly, and her gaze swept across the faces of her two brothers. Hibbert's brows immediately furrowed as he said, "I think it's best we return." This manor wasn't informed in advance, so they definitely weren't prepared. Perhaps there's no way for them to service so many horses, hounds, and servants. Besides, there's still an hour before the evening. There's enough time for us to return. When Alfred saw his brother change his mind so quickly, he wanted to act contrary to him. However, on second thought, he felt that what his brother said made sense. Considering that his sister was also here, he tersely agreed and said, "Then let's head back quickly." With that said, he didn't wait for Hibbert. Squeezing at the horse's side and brandishing the horsewhip, he led the way. Hibbert frowned, then relaxed. Without saying anything else, he led his sister, the group of attendants, servants, and hounds, and turned around, following the edge of the forest and returning to a manor on the other side. Audrey quietly followed behind him, not expressing her opinion on the development of the matter. Late at night, in a manor in East Chester County. Having used her manipulator powers to change the thoughts of her two brothers to prevent them from approaching Heartlark, Audrey lifted the velvet blanket and crawled into bed, entering a deep sleep. In her reverie, she suddenly sat up. She then looked around and saw the familiar dressing table and the bathroom entrance. She realized that she was still in the room, but the crimson moon outside the window was gone. There were no stars, only darkness. This isn't the real world. Audrey instantly made a judgment and inspected herself. Soon, she came to a conclusion. This was a dream. It was a rather strange dream that made her remain lucid. "It's really here." Audrey didn't feel any panic. She was just a little vexed. She hadn't handled the development properly in the afternoon, which led to the problem extending to the manor where her parents were. In hindsight, she believed that she should have followed Hibbert's idea and headed straight to the family manor near Heartlark. Then, she could reasonably arrange for Hibbert and Alfred to return here, leaving her to stay behind and wait for any possible developments. This way, even if anything happened, it wouldn't affect their parents, brothers, and most of the servants. However, at that time, her main goal wasn't to follow the arrangement of fate. As long as she could avoid Heartlark, she would try her best to avoid it. To her surprise, danger would, at times, spring on you even if you didn't seek it out. To avoid it and stall for time wasn't a universal solution. Audrey immediately got off the bed and stood barefoot on the thick carpet. She had already confirmed that, with her level of a demigod as a dreamwalker, she could directly escape this strange dream and return to the real world, avoiding the suspected invitation once more. After looking around, Audrey pursed her lips, removed the blue cloak hanging on the clothes rack beside her, and wore it. She took a deep breath and walked towards the door. During this process, a crimson star tattoo appeared on the back of her hand. The tattoo vanished as though it had never appeared. This was the mark left on her after her first entry into the ancient palace above the gray fog. For a very long time, it hadn't shown any special traits. It was only at the beginning of this year that Mr. Fool informed them that in situations in which they couldn't pray, they could use the triggering of the corresponding tattoo to skip the chanting of the honorific name. Simply put, this was a treatment that a blessed of a deity enjoyed. Of course, there was no way to transmit any information. It could only be used in critical situations, allowing Mr. Fool to cast his gaze over. And more importantly, the star-like crimson mark was rather eye-catching. It could be easily discovered by others and people who were secretly monitoring them. Therefore, under a situation where she needed to hide her uniqueness, Audrey was more inclined to use the various abilities of a manipulator to implant the idea of praying to Mr. Fool to some inconspicuous human nearby. She got them to complete the prayer at suitable times and locations and pray for her protection. At this moment, she believed that the owner of the dreamscape knew that she was problematic, so she felt that there was no need to go through all that trouble. All she needed to do was to hide the entity she was praying to. When she reached the door, Audrey reached out for the handle and gently twisted it before pulling it backward. The slightly dark corridor entered her vision. The main building of this manor had a history of over 100 years. Many places still had their former characteristics, especially the corridor section. It didn't have any gas lamps, and the walls were decorated with candle stands made of silver or copper. There were countless candles placed on them, emitting a dim yellow light that illuminated the entire corridor and creating all kinds of shadows. They gave a feeling that a phantasm might appear on the corridor at any moment. Even this has been replicated in the dreamscape. Audrey looked around and entered the corridor. As this thought flashed across her mind, a long, thick pale yellow carpet appeared beneath her feet. Stepping on the carpet, Audrey followed her spiritual intuition and walked to the right. After taking 2 or 3 steps, she suddenly stopped. She felt as if there was something hidden behind the 2 tightly shut doors, giving her a strong desire to explore. This is Father and Mother's bedroom. That is Hibbert's room. That is Alfred's room. Audrey made a slight note of it and frowned. The ancient doors with relief were extremely mysterious under the dim candlelight. It made one eager to know what was hidden behind them. As her thoughts raced, Audrey suddenly understood what they represented in a dream. This was the door to the mind world. Behind each door was the mind world of their owner. In other words, after Audrey pushed open Alfred's door, she would see the various secrets hidden deep in his heart. By the same logic, she could pry into the secrets of Lord Hall and Lady Caitlin. She slowly retracted her gaze. Audrey closed her eyes and continued walking forward, preventing herself from being affected. After all her experiences, she gradually understood a principle. A demigod in the mind domain needed to control themselves and respect others. Under the premise that she could read people's true thoughts through their body language, facial expressions, and emotional fluctuations, if she wasn't satisfied, she could greedily explore the inner thoughts of others and dig out their secrets. In the end, she would suffer a backlash. This was a very simple principle. Everyone had some darkness in them in varying amounts or nasty thoughts. However, they had control over them, preventing them from affecting their actions. Under such circumstances, if a demigod in the mind domain still insisted on digging these thoughts and dug out the ugly parts under the mask, it was very easy for them to be disappointed in human nature, be tainted by all kinds of negative thoughts, gradually becoming crazy without realizing it. This was also one of the reasons why, despite spectators being able to placate themselves and treat corresponding mental problems, They were also one of the pathways who would easily go mad or lose their composure. They were both safe and dangerous. Therefore, Audrey established rules for herself to observe. She only did observations and read the minds of people she knew. She tried her best not to enter their dreams. This restriction didn't apply to strangers. If it wasn't necessary, she wouldn't enter the mind world of anyone. Following the corridor, Audrey, who was wearing a blue cloak, reached its end. She opened her eyes and cast her gaze at the room on the left. It was a half-open solarium. Pursing her lips again, Audrey held the door handle with her breathing steady. As the wooden door opened, the scene inside was gradually revealed. This was no longer a room. On the ground were round pebbles and bundles of bluish-black weeds. It was so dark deep within that space that one couldn't see clearly. Audrey slowly walked in and closed the door behind her. In the darkness, the silhouettes of some objects were quickly outlined. A huge stone pillar that was tens of meters tall stood there. There was a tall lizard-like monster situated above it. The monster was squatting at the top of the stone pillar like a tiny mountain. Its body was covered with huge grayish-white stone scales, and its eyes were pale-fold and vertical. This was a mind dragon as spoken in myths. With a whoosh, the two wings of the mind dragon spread open, almost covering the entire sky. Their bones were like metallic leaf veins, covered with a gray membrane with mysterious patterns. As Audrey looked up, the mind dragon emitted a buzzing sound. "You've been to Liveseed." Without a doubt, it used Dragonese. "City of Miracles, Liveseed? How does it know?" Just as Audrey had these two thoughts, she heard the mind dragon say, "Everyone's consciousness in one's heart will make a certain exchange with the sea of collective subconscious. And for a unique place like Liveseed, it likewise left a special impression in you. When your virtual persona roams the sea of collective subconscious and isn't too far from me, I can naturally sense this. This exceeds the limits of my abilities, and it's not something a dreamweaver can do. This mind dragon corresponds to a sequence 2 discerner? He actually didn't directly control me." As Audrey's thoughts flashed, the mind dragon spoke again. "I'm sure you don't have any ill intentions at the moment." Audrey fell silent for 2 seconds before looking up and asking, "Aren't you worried that it's a trap?" Chapter 1342. Simultaneously at that moment, Audrey even suspected that the arrangement of fate wasn't for her to head to Heartlark to investigate the dragon-worshipping customs. Instead, it was to make her realize that something was wrong, causing her to feel conflicted. It made her use a virtual persona in the vicinity of Heartlark to secretly guide her two brothers into changing their minds without realizing it. This would inevitably result in her consciousness being specially related to Liveseed to be discovered by the mind dragon, thus attracting him. Despite being the one that had been arranged, Audrey couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. It had to be said that to achieve such an effect, one had to have an extremely high level of confidence in the reactions different people had. It struck fear into the bottom of her heart. After all, Audrey, a Sequence 4 manipulator, had felt that the development of the matter was in line with her expectations. She had completely fulfilled her wishes and wasn't alert at all. The mind dragon retracted its huge wings and looked down at the blue-cloaked Audrey. "This is a dream maze formed by many minds. Even if the one who set the trap personally descends, it will take some time to find this room. Besides, I won't stay long." Clearly, he had been wary of traps, but he believed that certain matters were worth the risk. Dream maze? This is a beyonder power of a dreamweaver, or perhaps the power after a qualitative change. Audrey reined in her thoughts and asked calmly, "What do you wish to know?" The gigantic grayish-white dragon buzzed and said, "My name is Airihog, one of the 3 remaining ancient dragons." He means that he is one of the 3 surviving dragons of the second epoch, and the rare, known dragons are only descendants of the dragons during the era of the ancient gods? Audrey nodded slightly and didn't interrupt him. Behind her was a wooden door that stood without any support in the plains filled with bluish-black weeds. It looked extremely strange. Airihog didn't waste any time. After introducing himself, he asked, "Where did you find Liveseed?" Audrey was already prepared as she answered frankly, in a book named Grozel's Travels. Rumor has it that it was personally created by the Dragon King Ankwelt. Grozel? Airihog clearly hadn't heard of this name before. After repeating it, he pressed, "What kind of book is that?" The blonde-haired Audrey gave a simple description. That's a book with a world that's almost real inside it. At the same time, it can suck in people who meet the requirements or offer their own blood to be sucked in by the book, allowing them to live in that world. Airihog fell silent for 2 seconds. Is there a sea of collective subconscious in that book world? Yes, Audrey answered with great certainty. The City of Miracles, Liveseed, I saw was deep in the sea of collective subconscious in the book world. Airihog suddenly breathed harder. What did you see in that Liveseed? Audrey recalled and said, a city filled with towering pillars and majestic palaces. In addition, I've also entered the residence of the Dragon King. That place can allow every living being's inner thoughts to echo in the surrounding area. I call it the Hall of Truth. At the end of the Hall of Truth, behind the Dragon King's throne, there's an ancient and mysterious bronze door. I'm not sure what's sealed behind. In short, it's very dangerous and I didn't dare approach it at all. Audrey was speaking the complete truth. She just didn't mention the speculations that Mr. World, Mr. Star, and she had come up with. Airihog fell completely silent. It was unknown what he was thinking of, or if he was analyzing the current situation regarding Liveseed. During this process, his head drooped down bit by bit, as though he was going to fall from the top of a 100-meter-tall pillar to the ground. Just as Audrey tensed up from this rather bizarre scene and was about to ask a question, Airihog suddenly raised his head. The golden vertical pupil in his eyes turned colder as his voice once again resounded in the wilderness. Liveseed, with a low rumbling of thunder, the things that were hidden in the dark behind Airihog quickly became clear. In the gradually brightening scene, their outlines appeared. They were huge stone pillars that were more than 100 meters tall. They were either standing alone or collectively propping up numerous majestic and ancient palaces. These stone pillars and palaces were mainly grayish-white in color as they landed on the island-like foundations. It was identical to the City of Miracles, Liveseed, which Audrey had just described. No, this was probably the City of Miracles, Liveseed. Only then did Audrey realize that the ancient mind dragon, Airihog, was squatting at the top of the thickest, tallest stone pillar. At this moment, she could faintly feel a subtle change in Airihog. Her green eyes darted about slightly, and the sound of a metal handle being twisted sounded from behind her. Audrey held back the urge to turn her head abruptly. She turned her body warily to the side, allowing her gaze to fall sideways. The individual wooden door that had lost its external support slowly opened, revealing the visitor's appearance. A huge, white rabbit with wiggling ears that walked upright. Above the gray fog, in the ancient palace, a figure was shrouded in grayish-white fog. He sat at the fool's seat at the end of the long mottled table as he silently observed the crimson star representing justice. Backlund, West Borough, 9 Bellato Street. The closer Wendell was to the end of the 2 weeks, the more he suffered from insomnia. He had to rely on medication to fall asleep. When he woke up, he was also restless and extremely anxious. He had lost all interest in food and only forced himself to eat the 3 meals sent by his colleagues to ensure his energy. He didn't know what would happen on the date of the trial, nor did he know if there would be an irreversible change in his body. This kind of fear towards the unknown often made him feel stifled. It was extremely tortuous. Sometimes, Wendell would even think that it might not be a wise choice resisting his return to Utopia. Based on his limited experience there, if he obediently returned to Utopia and testified in court, there was a high chance that he would leave safely. At least up to this point, Wendell hadn't heard of anyone dying or going crazy because of Utopia. The people there were rather friendly apart from being a little bizarre. I'm just going to help. They should be grateful to me instead of being antagonistic. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that it would be more comfortable to face the danger. Of course, he had no doubts about MI9's protective capabilities. If it wasn't possible, he felt that he could only consider meeting the Lord of Storms early. Phew. Wendell exhaled and sat down on his chair. He casually picked up a novel to pass time. However, his frustration made it impossible for him to immerse himself in the plot. He flipped through the pages more frequently and finally he snapped the book close. He closed his eyes and prepared to take a nap. In a daze, Wendell seemed to return to Utopia and arrived at the court. However, the role he was in wasn't as a witness but a member of the audience. Tracy was deemed by the judge to have provided insufficient evidence to support a claim for self-defense and had been transferred to the criminal courts. He saw this lady tearing up in a daze, her smile extremely miserable. Wendell woke up and stared silently at the wall lamp in front of him. He sat there motionless for a long time. If the problem is Utopia, and not the residents of Utopia, then me avoiding it might end up killing a poor lady. Wendell retracted his gaze. His resolve had wavered slightly, but he was unable to overcome the fear in his heart. With his hands on the table, he stood up and walked to the door. He planned to wander about MI9's headquarters to ease his mood. After leaving the room and taking a few steps forward, Wendell suddenly heard a colleague in the office discussing the related case of the Utopia. "Have you heard? The person who entered Utopia was a carriage driver. He sent a merchant from Utopia to the dock area, and with just taking 2 turns at a crossroads, he found himself somewhere unfamiliar. There's a need to warn all the carriage drivers in Backland. Yes, it's best to draw a parallel between Utopia and the spies, so that they can understand. The way of entering and exiting Utopia is really frightening. Sometimes, I even suspect that the entrance to Utopia might appear anywhere. There's definitely a limit to this. It's not as omnipotent as we imagine. Otherwise, I might find myself in Utopia just by paying a visit to the washroom. According to the current patterns we've figured, this is theoretically valid." When Wendell heard that, his blood vessels on his forehead began to throb. He suddenly felt that even if he was in the headquarters of MI9, he wouldn't be that safe. Unless there's a demigod watching me the entire time, it's very difficult for me to avoid the fate of returning to Utopia. Perhaps, after I wash my hands and open the washroom door, I'll discover that it's the Iris's hotel outside. No, ordinary demigods might not be able to stop such a thing. This doesn't seem like it's something humans can accomplish. It's already extremely close to that of a deity. Wendell instantly panicked, unable to suppress the fear in his heart. He returned to the room and took out the subpoena from the Utopian court. Immediately following that, Wendell entered the washroom and held the document as he muttered in fear, "I'm willing to go to court to testify. I'm willing to go to court to testify." After repeating himself a few times, he reached out to grab the handle of the bathroom door. At that moment, a black raven flew through the ventilation hole like a ghost and landed in a corner of the washroom that no one would notice. In the next second, Wendell twisted the handle, pulled the door back, and opened the washroom door. It was no longer his familiar bedroom but an unfamiliar lobby. Chapter 1343 Weaved Nightmare. I really returned to Utopia? Upon seeing the scene outside, Wendell felt a baffling sense of relief and ease. He no longer had any doubts about his choice to go to testify in court. It had to be known that he was in the washroom of MI9's headquarters. It was a place that was impossible to invade even with a fully armed army. Wendell slowly exhaled as he walked out of the washroom and towards the entrance of the lobby. Behind him, in a corner of the washroom where no one was paying attention to, the pitch-black raven had draped over a shadow-like veil, losing its physical presence. Even if one were to directly look at it, it would be difficult to discover it. Then, its body became more and more transparent as it rapidly dissipated until it vanished. At this moment, Wendell had already walked a few meters out of the lobby when he saw a police officer in a black and white checkered uniform. This was the young officer who had requested him to testify, Biles. "I knew you'd come, because you're a kind person." Biles smiled at Wendell. When he heard the compliment, Wendell's strung-up heart finally returned to normal. Then, he instinctively turned his head back and saw that the bathroom that he had come out of had changed completely in style. It was no longer familiar to him. In the dream maze formed by many minds, the huge white rabbit that walked upright squeezed through the open door and entered the vast wilderness with the grayish-white pillars and magnificent palaces. Mr. Rath, although it wasn't wearing the persona mask, its unforgettable characteristics were enough for Audrey to recognize him at a glance. This was out of her expectations, but it wasn't too surprising. From her point of view, just Mr. Rath alone likely wasn't enough to deal with an ancient mind dragon like Aerihog, even if Mr. Fool had warned her to be wary of Mr. Rath. After all, the leader behind the psychology alchemists, the former king of angels, had already become a sequence zero true god. According to the knowledge shared by the Tarot Club, there shouldn't be any other author beyonders in the real world. This way, no matter how powerful Mr. Rath was, as long as it was still part of the spectator pathway, it would at most be on the same level as Aerihog. The only things that would differ were combat experience, psychological research, and self-cultivation. At this moment, as the giant white rabbit entered, the large, grayish-white, scaled Aerihog spread open his wings which covered his skin. The surrounding area was instantly covered in a shadow. With a leap, the white rabbit's legs suddenly became extremely huge, like a tiny hill. At the same time, the gloomy sky above him lit up. The ground beneath his feet cracked open, spewing out crimson lava. Immediately after, a blurry and distorted figure appeared behind it. This figure was dressed in a simple white robe. It was difficult to see his face clearly, and it was impossible to tell his age. One could only vaguely tell that he was a man. A bright halo hung at the back of his head like a miniature sun. Beneath his feet was an illusory clock that was divided into 12 segments. Each segment represented a different symbol of time. Behind him, there was a shadow that looked like a curtain. Eyes seemed to be looking out from the shadow. Just after this figure appeared, the entire dream maze shook violently, and gray fragments fell from the void. The contrast of depravity and pure sunlight rapidly spread around the huge white rabbit, eroding or assimilating the area. However, that simple white-robed figure had trouble truly taking shape. He was unable to enter reality from history and illusions. Every time his silhouette became clear, his figure would distort like a machine that had its signal disrupted. At that moment, Audrey instinctively retracted her gaze, not daring to look directly at the huge white rabbit. Perhaps it was because she was in a dream and was closely connected to the mind island and the sea of collective subconscious. She didn't need anyone to explain to her because she knew what Mr. Rath was doing. The other party knew the latent psychological problems of Aerihog and knew what he feared the most. Then, according to this, it produced a nightmare that contained the specific images. In a battle between high-sequence beyonders of the spectator pathway, if both parties were at the same level, it would be difficult to produce any true effects using the various means available to them. One could sneak into the island of consciousness and attempt deep hypnosis. The other could guard the door to the body of heart and mind, preventing any foreign consciousness from entering. The other could spread a mental plague and use the sea of collective subconscious to intrude on the enemy without them realizing it. The other would be able to placate themselves, treat the psychological ailments, and maintain their mental health. Therefore, the battle between same-sequence spectator saints often had three fixed styles. First, set up a trap ahead of time as a multi-pronged attack preparation. Then, by secretly leading on and guiding the opponent, one could break down their mental defenses in one strike and complete the hypnosis. Second, one focused on their physical defense and as support, relying on powerful sealed artifacts to defeat their enemy. Third, when the beyonder powers such as mental plague, mind deprivation, dragon's breath, consciousness control, and other beyonder powers were unable to deal with their opponent, engaging in self-hypnotism and using dragon transformation would result in an intense melee battle that exchanged claw swipes and tail lashes. In the third battle, whoever had a deeper understanding of the mind domain, and whose will was stronger and firmer, would be able to gain the upper hand by relying on the extended usage of dragon transformation. Of course, the prerequisite was that the other party had no chance of escaping. And at the level of an angel, everyone was a true mythical creature. The maintenance time of dragon transformation became meaningless. At this moment, it mainly depended on observation. Whoever could find a flaw in the opponent's mind could weave a corresponding nightmare, directly attacking the enemy's weaknesses, slowly destroying their mental defenses and reaching the effect of going mad or dying out of fear. As Audrey was in the same dream, even if the nightmare wasn't directed at her, she was still affected by the corresponding emotions, characteristics, status, and even corruption. Now, she clearly knew that the nightmare that Mr. Wrath had weaved represented the ancient sun god. This was the most terrifying existence in Airihog's mind. At the same time, the ancient sun god's influence would uncontrollably corrupt the surroundings until it reached the entire dream. When the time came, once Audrey woke up, she would either become an untreatable mentally ill patient, or she would become an incomplete mythical creature, completely losing all reason and ending up wildly attacking the surrounding creatures. Of course, there was another possibility that she unknowingly became depraved. She would become cold, cruel, and bloodthirsty without realizing it, as if someone had replaced her. At this moment, Airihog, who was squatting at the top of the grayish-white pillar, let out a painful howl. As the dragon's roar echoed, the top of his head turned dark, revealing a sea of secrets and colors that was difficult to describe with words. In the sea, an even bigger grayish-white dragon spanning 1,000 meters long rose up. One of his vertical pupils was pale gold and the other was bright red color. There was a third eye on the dragon's forehead. It seemed to be hiding a thick shadow. Similarly, there was no need for anyone to explain. With the uniqueness of her present state, Audrey immediately knew what nightmare Airihog had weaved. This was something that left a deep trauma in the giant white rabbit's heart. This was the Ankwelt that had been corrupted by the underground world. This was the virtual persona and mental corruption which was sealed behind the bronze door, things that had been split off from that ancient god. At that moment, Audrey was in an indescribable nightmare. Although she hadn't been corrupted, her mental state was in turmoil, as though she had been awed. She immediately used placate on herself and didn't hesitate to rely on her own consciousness to forcefully escape the dream maze. During this process, she didn't encounter any obstruction not just because she wasn't Airihog's and Mr. Wrath's target, but also because she had reached sequence 4 and possessed a certain amount of godhood. Therefore, she quickly woke up from her dream. Audrey suddenly opened her eyes and saw a crystal chandelier dyed in faint crimson. She saw the deep darkness of the room. Without any delay, she got out of bed and ran to the window to look outside. The entire manor was completely silent, as if it was deep asleep. Everything was normal. Audrey frowned and immediately split out a virtual person, allowing it to enter the mind island of a night patroller. She remembered very clearly that the dream maze was formed by many minds. Once the two nightmares spread, the result was unimaginable. Therefore, before this, she had to wake up everyone in the manor. In the next second, the patrolling guard suddenly raised his hand and removed the grenade hanging from his belt. He pulled out the pin and threw it towards an empty garden. Boom! The loud explosion jolted awake the sleeping people. Immediately after, the guard shouted loudly, "Enemy assault! Enemy assault!" Earl Hall and his wife were already over 50 years old, so as light sleepers, they jolted awake immediately. Regardless of how good Hibbert's sleep quality was, he woke up in a reverie thanks to such a loud explosion. Alfred had opened his eyes the moment the grenade was thrown. The remaining butler, maids, footmen, and bodyguards woke up one after another. They looked confused and dumbfounded, not knowing what had happened. And at the far end of the manor's main building, a few servants heard the commotion and didn't wake up in time. A few seconds later, they struggled on the bed in pain. Like a snake shedding its skin, they broke free from their skin, turning into hideous bodies of blood. They didn't wake up until they died. At that moment, Audrey saw a grayish-white dragon spread its wings in the sea of collective subconscious as it rapidly departed. A huge white rabbit followed closely behind. In the blink of an eye, the dragon's voice resounded in the illusory sea. Adam isn't necessarily Adam, just like how I might not necessarily be Airihog. The giant white rabbit suddenly slowed down and gradually stopped. All the abnormalities came to an end as the entire area returned to normal. In the ancient palace above the fog, Adam didn't attack? The fool Klein frowned slightly as he turned his attention back to Utopia and replaced the instinctual monitoring of the worms of spirit. He carefully inspected his marionette town and didn't find anything abnormal. Chapter 1344 Humanity. Seeing that there weren't any abnormalities in the town of marionettes, Klein began thinking about Miss Justice's encounter. It wasn't Adam who set up an attack against Aerihog, but Hermes who masterminded it? Otherwise, it wouldn't be possible for Adam to not descend. It would also be impossible for Aerihog to escape so easily. He had to rely on the second city of miracles to have some hope of doing so. If Hermes was the mastermind, the development of this whole episode becomes logical. Hermes never thought of capturing or killing Aerihog. He only hopes to learn some information from this ancient mind dragon. When Aerihog said Adam isn't necessarily Adam, the operation came to a natural end. Yes, from the looks of it, Hermes already had some doubts about Adam's true state. However, due to the limitations of his status, he has been unable to make Aerihog appear on his own accord, so he used Miss Justice. Adam isn't necessarily Adam, Aerihog isn't necessarily Aerihog. This sentence is very interesting. The upper echelons of the spectator pathway are more mysterious than seers. Back then, Dragon of Imagination Ankwelt clearly occupied sequence 0, but he had a sequence 1 son of the same pathway as him, Dragon of Nightmare, Alzahad. If Adam really isn't Adam, then who is he? Is it that Adam from the myth in the time before the first epic, or part of the primordial one? Or is he related to the resurrection of the ancient sun god? From the looks of it, the meaning behind why Medici addresses him as a zealot has a far more profound meaning. Klein quickly conjured a gold coin and flicked it into the air, making a divination. The results of the divination indicated that today's development was nothing dangerous. Klein immediately dispersed the gold coin and prepared to descend his consciousness into his body beneath St. Ariana Cathedral. At this moment, his actions became slightly sluggish. The moment Miss Justice met Aerihog and Hermes was almost simultaneous as the moment the MI9 personnel returned to Utopia to testify in court. Just looking at them individually, there was no problem, but the word simultaneous made Klein somewhat alert. He was very sensitive to words like happen to, coincidence, simultaneous, and almost the same. This was a mark left behind by his past experiences. He tapped his finger on the edge of the long model table and decided to make preparations for his worries. He quickly condensed a light that contained certain words and some kind of will, and he threw it into a prayer light. After doing this, Klein made his consciousness sink and left Sapphira Castle, allowing his mind to return to his original body. Immediately after, he began to influence Utopia. He planned to use all sorts of arrangements to temporarily make all the foreigners leave. This way, even if anything happened, it wouldn't affect the innocent. This also meant that Klein was prepared to abandon Utopia and change locations to rebuild his marionette town. After all, a ritual could be repeated many times, but he could only afford one resurrection. Have a good rest for the next 2 days. There's still some time left before court begins. Biles sent Wendell to the entrance of the Iris's hotel. Wendell replied with a smile, "I'm already feeling sleepy." It was in the middle of the night. He had trouble sleeping previously because of his anxiety and nervousness. That was why he thought of walking around the headquarters of MI9 to ease his mood. However, when he heard the conversation between his colleagues at night, it triggered an eruption in his emotions, and he decided to return to Utopia and face the problem. After checking in, Wendell took his luggage and went to the 3rd floor. When he passed through the door, he vaguely felt that his surroundings were abnormally dark. In order to sleep better, Wendell walked to the window and drew the curtains. During this process, he felt that the scenery outside the window was unusually familiar. However, under the cover of the night, he couldn't tell what was happening too clearly. Thinking that it might have been the scene he had seen in Utopia previously, he covered his mouth with his hand and yawned. He took off his clothes and walked towards the bed. Monica slept until midnight when she suddenly needed to pee. Unable to hold it in any longer, she eventually got out of bed and walked towards her room's attached bathroom. When she pushed the bathroom door open, she found it a little heavier. Rubbing her eyes that were almost unable to open, Monica didn't care about this small change. She quickly relieved herself and ran out of the bathroom to her bed. When she entered the covers, she felt that the temperature was much lower and she had no choice but to wrap herself up tightly in layers. It didn't take long for her to fall asleep again. About 15 minutes later, the patrolling Biles rubbed his hands and turned towards the street where the police station was. He was about to hand over duties with his colleagues. Suddenly, his body froze in the alley. The black and dense spirit body threads on his body peeled off at the same time as they floated upwards. A pruned and exquisite paper figurine landed and connected to the spirit body threads, quickly turning into another Biles. At the same time, a torrent of mixed knowledge surged over and reassembled him into a man wearing gorgeous clothes with long chestnut hair. The man had blue eyes, a high nose bridge, and thin lips. It was Roselle Gustav's Sequence 1 historical projection. Right on the heels of that, the projection reached out and sucked all the information in the surroundings into its palm, forming an illusory ball of light. This information included all the details that involved Biles. In the next second, Roselle Gustav's historical projection forged a piece of information that was completely normal, allowing it to follow the spirit body threads connected to the paper figurine to the St. Ariana Cathedral in the municipal square, moving straight underground of the cathedral. After this series of actions, another torrent of information surged in midair. With Roselle's help, they reformed into 3 figures. A middle-aged man wearing a black robe and a hood with a long, thick white beard. Another, who was draped in a cloak, had black hair, blue eyes, and a rather squarish face. He was a middle-aged man with a dignified bearing. On one of the trees, there was a huge tree that seemed to be drenched with petroleum. On the tree, there were arms with all sorts of strange protruding objects that rolled with bloodshot eyes. They were the leader of the secret order, Zeratul. Lone's protector, the first king, William Augustus I's historical projection. A historical projection of Abomination Sua. After making the necessary preparations, Zeratul used the location provided by the historical projection to sneak into Utopia. He didn't waste any time. He reached out with his right hand and used the law of convergence of beyonder characteristics to suck out the worm of spirit in Biles. Elsewhere, the palm of Abomination Sua's historical projection made an ugly doll the size of a palm appear. The doll was wet and sticky. It had no eyes, ears, or nose. It only had a pinhole-like mouth that emitted and sucked grayish-white fog. As the worm of spirit and the doll approached, the black and white eyeballs that rolled out on the Sua tree trunk looked at them at the same time. Silently, the worm of spirit fused with the ugly doll, causing it to distort as it squirmed, growing out eyes, nose, and ears, making it look like Klein Moretti. At this point, Zeratul no longer did any concealment, nor could he do so. He took out a black shroud and abruptly wrapped Klein's doll up. All the marionette's spirit body threads in Utopia were severed at the same time. They were unable to connect to the true body. This wasn't because there was something wrong with them, but that the true body was isolated from them. All of a sudden, the duty personnel in the police station, tenants in the hotel, Tracy and the thieves in the cell, Anderson in another apartment, Alzu, and the other citizens all stopped breathing and turned stiff. Regardless of whether they were sleeping or doing something else, it was as if a pause button had been pressed. Klein, who was at the bottom of St. Ariana Cathedral, suddenly woke up. He knew that an accident had happened. He didn't hesitate. With a thought, he returned to Sapphira Castle. With the level and strength of a king of angels, he was able to resist enemies that had shown or had yet to show themselves. This was the best choice in the current situation. Even if he wasn't able to protect his true body, Klein still had a chance to revive. At that moment, his floating consciousness touched an invisible, dark barrier, making it difficult to penetrate it and enter Sapphira Castle. Klein's heart tightened, believing that the enemy might be more troublesome than he had imagined. Few high-level existences knew he could return to Sapphira Castle with a thought. In the next second, the thick, petroleum-slathered tree had arrived above St. Ariana Cathedral. In addition, a deep and dignified voice resounded, "Wandering is prohibited here. Teleportation is prohibited here." Klein wasn't led by his emotions. Seeing that he couldn't return to Sapphira Castle at the moment, he immediately changed his strategy and leaped towards the fog of history. The moment the grayish-white fog entered his eyes, it turned into a whirlpool formed by countless transparent maggots. The vortex extended out slippery tentacles covered with strange patterns. Unlike previously, the vortex emitted a powerful suction force, causing Klein's figure to speed up and be entangled by countless tentacles. Law of Beyonder Characteristics Convergence. The law of Beyonder Characteristic Convergence between angels. A subtle beam of light flashed as Klein, who was firmly controlled by Zeratl's mythical creature form, turned into a paper figurine. This was an angel-level application of paper figurine substitutes, as well as the help of grafting. Although Klein couldn't return to Sapphira Castle, he could influence the worms of spirit above the gray fog, allowing them to use the curtain to provide help. After dodging Zeratl's fatal blow, Klein ran into the fog of history and fled towards the former metropolis from a time before the first epoch. At this moment, many marionettes, who had been dead for a long time in Utopia, rapidly decayed from losing the spirit-body threads maintaining them. Their limbs dropped to the ground or mutated because of their Beyonder characteristics. The latter transformed into different monsters, ones far more terrifying than imaginable. Some swallowed their heads, others were left with only squirming flesh, while others grew dense eyes. Soon, Klein ran into the old metropolis situated inside the fog of history. To him, this was a safe room that could be trusted. This was because only a scholar of yore who was a human from before history could enter. Without any hesitation, Klein habitually surveyed the area and began praying to the Evernight goddess in the stacked city. A faint sound rang out as an ancient wooden stake with traces of blood penetrated Klein's heart from behind. A figure phased into existence behind him. It was a cold-looking man wearing a half-top hat and a black trench coat, Gehrman Sparrow. Klein's pupils dilated as the crazy adventurer said in a deep voice, "Adam has given me humanity." You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.